everyone. My name is Trevor Grassi. I'm coming back after a short intermission, and I've got Manu Seyfzadeh here again. We're going to dive deep into the next part of this subject material after speaking about the Sphinx and all this material that Manu's brought forward from there that constitutes absolute evidence that the Sphinx is actually older than Khafre's time, that it is related to this archive of knowledge stored at a very remote period, vastly pre-dynastic. It leads us into a further discussion of the possibility of advanced civilizations existing in prehistory, which is really the core of, I think, what both of us are so passionate about. And where you went from there has been something so exciting for me. We're going to be talking now about the Edfu building texts. They're inscriptions on the walls of the Temple of Horus at Edfu, which is it's in Upper Egypt. It's not, in Lower Egypt is the pyramids in Giza, but now we're going down south to where there's all the temples, which have all these inscriptions. And the Temple of Horus at Edfu, it's a later kingdom temple, but it tells us in these inscriptions on the walls that these inscriptions were coming from much older sources, and they were put there at a later date, but we were told that they come from this very early period of Egypt. And yeah, you are someone who has actually once again gotten to the deepest levels of this question because it was raised by others such as Graham Hancock. And I'll ask you to start by talking about some of that and how you first came across the idea that this could be actually a story that is ultimately so important because it is listening to the Egyptians themselves and what they said about their own origins, their own history, and the earliest point of their own origins, which is obviously there could be nothing more important than this, than actually getting to what they said about their own history. Very, very important subject that complements a lot of the material we've already been talking about. And all of this is really giving good context for some of the new discoveries that are coming out of Egypt today. So, yeah, this is really important context the world doesn't know about. We want to get into it nice and deep here. Go
Yeah.
all the way. So welcome again. Thank you so
hmm
much for doing this. And yeah, maybe we can start out with some of the first stuff.
Yeah. In many ways, this what we're doing now is the prequel to what we just did an hour ago, right, Trevor? We talked about what's under the Sphinx, and now we're talking about what may have been put under the Sphinx, right? From a prior
Yeah.
cycle of sophisticated civilization, and that's what Graham tackled in his book Magicians of the Gods. It's an interesting, this is one of those examples where a little email exchange just leads to this gigantic project, okay? Because
Yeah,
there was
well,
an email.
if someone put something under the Sphinx, who put it there?
Yeah,
That's the
yeah, exactly.
question,
That
obviously.
that's
And
right,
then,
exactly. And Graham, of course, that's the big vision that Graham has is that there was a civilization and a sophisticated civilization that was drowned, and it left some of its knowledge in some kind of recorded form for the next cycle of civilization. And that is what, people refer to the Hall of Records. And in my reconstruction, the Hall of Records is a cavern, and there may have been a box with some records from that earlier cycle. Um, and then, as we discussed before, maybe there was astronomical knowledge, right?
yeah,
And no, what Graham was interested, and this goes back into the late 90s, he wanted to know, um, is there something to the Edfu text that can tell us about how the ancient Egyptians reconstruct their own history? What, in other words, how they came to be at Zeb Tepi at the first time. And the Edfu text is probably the most voluminous and extensive record of that, because that the mythology of ancient Egypt it is described at lengths in the
yeah.
Edfu temple. So most of the Edfu, it's a gigantic book,
I
megalithic
was, I
book.
was gonna say actually for starters that when you're standing in the Temple of Edfu, there are so many walls,
Yeah,
all like
yeah,
40, 50 feet high.
right.
And
right,
every single one of them has these multiple courses of inscriptions. If you
right.
really wrote that whole book down, it would probably be three, four, five times longer than the Bible.
Yeah, yeah. There's
Just
several
rough
hundred
estimate.
thousand symbols, hieroglyphs written on those walls. Now it turns out that about I want to say about 80%, 85% maybe are rituals. They're offering rituals where you see the king or the queen making offerings to the gods of Egypt. But about 15% are these stories, right? These ancient mythological stories about the origin of the universe, about how Egypt came to be, and about the contendings between Horus and Set. But most of these texts were not translated until relatively recently by the German Edfu project. Here and there, texts had been, especially the French were very active in, because there was a Frenchman, an archaeologist, a surveyor by the name of Emile Chassinat, or an archaeologist who surveyed the Edfu temple, and he transcribed all of these symbols into this massive body of books, 14 volumes. And then people started translating after he transcribed the symbols. They started translating here and there, but there was errors. Chassinat, great credit to him. He did a lot of work, but there were a few errors, and we're not just talking about a handful, but maybe thousands. According to Dieter Kort, the chief of the German Edfu project, there's something like 3,000 transcription errors, interpretive errors, right? And so what the Germans did, they took high resolution color photography with cameras on a long telescope arm, right? And it's amazing. I have several thousands of these images that I inherited from Dieter. He gave them to me. So Dieter Kort and I were friends. We made friendship a couple of years ago. I've been to his house a couple of times. He's been to my parents' house a couple of times. And of course, I got his books, Ptolemaic Hieroglyphic. It's a difficult subject. And by no means am I saying here that I can walk up to a Ptolemaic temple and read it off. It's very difficult. There's probably Dieter Kort and maybe two other people, three other people, maybe Christian Lights, some like Joachim Quack maybe. They may be able to do that, or David Klotz maybe. But there's only few people, even among the Egyptologists. Like there's about 1,000 people that read hieroglyphic, and out of those 1,000 people, there may be a handful that can walk up to a Ptolemaic temple and just cold read it. But
Well, could
I,
you
yeah,
actually, one of the questions I wanted to kind of cover here is maybe it's a good time to do it is can you speak a little bit about the difference between the hieroglyphs coming from the old
yeah,
and to the new and how
right,
many hieroglyphs were there in the old kingdom versus the Ptolemaic
yeah,
and the complications with translating the ones that get more complicated because
right,
we have a language that's built on 26 letters,
right,
characters.
right,
And even in the old kingdom, there was more than that. But
yeah,
how many did it
yeah.
actually end up being?
Yeah, they so the so it ends up with about 2,000 according to Dieter Kort. 2,000 during Ptolemaic times, and but in the pyramid text, 600, 700 maybe. And out of those 6, 700, there are just a few, like 2 dozen that are actually they're the most common ones. They're actually just phonetic single consonant symbols, and all the other ones are either context symbols, or they're called biliterals or triliterals. So it's basically two or three consonants in a row. Interestingly, Ptolemaic hieroglyphic. So Ptolemaic hieroglyphic, you have to remember that the Ptolemies were Greeks, and when they came to Egypt with Ptolemy the First, right, Alexander the Great's general, he took the body, he kidnapped or hijacked Alexander's body and took it to Egypt, and then Alexander was entombed in Alexandria, and then of the body disappears, right? That's the story with that. But Ptolemy founds basically the Ptolemaic kingdom, and the Ptolemies didn't speak Egyptian. And at that time, the ancient Egyptians spoke a language called Demotic, and they were writing in a script that's also called Demotic, which is it's a cursive, a very cursive version of hieratic. But the language is also different, right?
And
So the
Arabic is already that's like a split between Egyptian and Greek kind of.
hieratic.
Yeah,
You
is that
mean
right?
hieratic? So hieratic is handwritten hieroglyphic, and hieratic goes all the way back to the very first beginning of writing, probably not much later. So there's hieratic writing in the Old Kingdom, and no, but so the Old Kingdom Egyptians spoke a language called Old Egyptian. The Middle Kingdom Egyptians spoke a language called Middle Egyptian, which is almost like Old Egyptian. There's only a few small differences. So they probably would have understood each other. But then after the second intermediate period, you have the New Kingdom, and at the beginning of the New Kingdom, Middle Egyptian is almost a lost language at that point. So it phases out at the beginning of the New Kingdom, and then comes what we call Late Egyptian. So Late Egyptian begins to be spoken, with the New Kingdom, and by the time of the Ptolemies, Middle Egyptian was extinct as a language, I'm saying. I'm not talking about the hieroglyphic script. I'm talking about the language of the Middle Kingdom, right? And that's a big cause of confusion in the critics. I've seen people criticizing what we're saying because they don't understand the difference between script and language, okay? The script is hieroglyphic. Now, what the Ptolemies did when they commissioned the scribes to resurrect these mythical texts, so the originals that they had to work with were in hieratic. So hieratic is handwritten hieroglyphic, right? And Dr. Court, his analysis tells him that the basic language of the Edfu text is Middle Egyptian. Okay. Now, there's going to be people that are going to say, well, why does that matter? Because Middle Egyptian was still used as a language even in later periods, and they're correct. But it's not authentic Middle Egyptian. It's called traditional Egyptian. And so what's the difference? Well, the difference is there are slip-ups. So, it's kind of like nowadays, if we wanted to make our language, let's say something we write, we want to make it sound old, we're going to try to emulate older versions of English, like Shakespearean English, let's say. But because we don't speak like that any longer, we would slip up. There would be some places in the text where we would slip up back into modern ways of speaking or writing. And that's the telltale sign that it's not authentic Shakespearean English. It's actually a modern writer that's just trying to sound like a Shakespearean English writer, right? And this is the same thing here. We have traditional, we have traditional, we have traditional Egyptian, and the slip ups into late Egyptian is what gives it away as a basically fake Middle Egyptian. Okay, so the Edfu text, the mythical texts,
Doesn't
are
mean the
written.
context is fake, but the language, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right. So
Content, I mean. Yeah.
yeah, so this argument, right, that Edfu text came after Plato is a mute, because the originals that they were written in is based on Middle Egyptian, which is obviously older than Plato, but that's not. I'm not even resting my argument on even the language, okay? Even having said everything I told you right now, right? So clearly Dr. Court's saying that the mythological texts they have their own archaic grammar. So they're clearly distinguished from the bulk of the Edfu text. They're obviously older texts, okay? But I'm not resting my argument on the grammatical analysis of the language. No. What I'm resting it on are the themes, which is what you pointed out in introduction, right? The themes of the Edfu mythological story go all the way back to the pyramid texts. So these are old themes. And for example, the idea of Ptah using logos to create, right? That's Shabaka stone. Shabaka stone is clearly before Plato. We're talking, the end of the 7th century BC, or rather 8th century BC.
Yeah.
So I'm not resting the bulk of my argument on the linguistic analysis. No, I'm resting the bulk of my analysis on the thematic analysis. And that's what Graham did. Graham looked at the structure of the Edfu text, and he didn't have the translation at his disposal. He actually looked through the lens that was handed to him by Eve Raymond, who was a great Egyptologist as a graduate student. That was her project, right? She was looking at the mythological basis of the Egyptian temple, and she looked at the Edfu text from the transcriptions of Emile Chassinat. So she did some of her own translations, but she didn't publish them. So Graham did not have this at his disposal, so he had to look through the lens of Eve Raymond to extract the main themes of the Edfu text. And he put that into a couple of sections in Magicians of the Gods. And then Graham was criticized as late as just last year. And I don't want to even mention names, because it's not about I'm not criticizing anybody personally. I just want to make the point that the critiques that Graham has received are not just unfair, they're also trivially wrong. Now, there's not even any level of sophistication because Graham is absolutely correct with this distillation of the thematic structure of the Edfu text. People don't know this, but most people don't know this, but Graham is a world expert at compositional analysis. Okay. He is like, like an anatomist. He has X-ray vision. He can look through the lines of a text and extract the main themes and how those themes are lining up logically. He's excellent at doing that. And I am a beneficiary of that because as you know, he didn't just write the foreword for Under the Sphinx. He actually did a structural analysis of my book and he discovered something that he told me that I need to restructure the argument, and that's what I ended up doing, right? It was an amazing a suggestion that I would have never come up with by myself, right? So that's what he did for the Edfu text. And so when I had an email exchange with Graham a couple of years ago, he said to me that he had some issues being able to go back to Egypt, and he's saying one of those reasons is because I'm saying that that Plato's dialogues, the story, can be found at Edfu, and somebody took offense at that, and basically, and in so many ways. Convey to Graham, you're no longer welcome in Egypt, okay? And I felt so bad for Graham when he said that to me. I said, you know what? Let me take a look at this and see if what is the actual text saying? Not Eve Raymond. What are the actual Edfu texts saying, right? And so this is how this whole thing came about. And that's why I put my nose into Dieter Kurtz's books. I had the translations in German, and I even published. And because I thought that was so important for so many people, I took a piece, the main piece of the mythology, the Memphite creation story, and I translated what Kurt had translated into German, into English, but I also paid attention to the original writing. So because I can read hieroglyphic to some extent, I have an intermediate working knowledge of it. I can connect to see if the German translation is consistent with the hieroglyphic, and then so that I don't just adopt Germanisms into the English translation, but stick with the original text. That's why it was helpful for me to be able to recognize the symbols and being able to translate the symbols, right? Yeah. So that's how this whole thing came about. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
yeah,
I mean, yeah, just kind of clarify or sum that up. What you're saying is basically, yeah, by the late Ptolemaic kingdom, it was like there were so many hieroglyphs in this language. It became an extremely complex and convoluted and very difficult
yeah,
language to translate. 2,000 letters as opposed to
yeah.
26 in English. You
It's
can
a zoo.
imagine. And
It's
then
a zoo. Yeah,
yeah, so it's really fair to say that it's, Eve Raymond did a great job.
right,
Of course, had all these errors that, we've
right.
got a starting point there, but we need to clarify this stuff. And then Graham hit that with the thematic elements to it that do correspond to all these other that getting to the heart of the chase here, really, it is corresponding very well with Plato's account of Atlantis, with Edgar Cayce's information as well. And he saw enough of that to bring it into the realm of the conversation.
You did.
And it was yeah, it was you who recognized there was something to that, but it needs to be further defined and actually taken to a level that's more
Yeah,
set in stone. And so
yeah.
you yeah, Dieter Kurth, you're saying he was the German and he's been working there for what, 20, 30 years, decades. The
36 years, yeah. So,
yeah, the
by the way,
evidence out
I
there.
want to make sure that your audience understands. I am definitely not saying that Dr. Kurt agrees with my analysis of this. Okay, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying he disagrees or agrees. It's interesting that Dr. Kurt himself has an article out where he does draw some parallels between Plato and the Edfu text. Okay, not to the extent that I am saying here, or that that Graham said. But I don't want to make it sound like that Dr. Kurt blessed, my analysis. I'm not trying to say
Yeah.
that. No.
Well, no,
Uh,
but he did he took it to this step further that needed to be taken because there was
right,
all these errors and spending all this time with his whole team
right.
exhaustively documenting every single part of the
Right,
temple and finding where this stuff was. But their
right.
entire project ended up coming out in German. And so because
Yeah,
you speak German, you're really
right,
the one who's giving us the first ever definitive English translation because you're working from
right,
the glyphs straight from the glyphs themselves as well as
right.
most
Yeah,
German.
that's very important.
Yeah.
And by the way, I just put a video out there. I'm sure you've seen it on my presentation at Graham's. It's the extended version of the presentation that I made when Graham was on stage and he called me onto the stage for 20 minutes and to basically make the case on the walls of the Edfu temple. And this happened just a couple of weeks ago. So we don't have to go through everything because people can easily just watch the video. But in terms of, our conversation right here, I want to give you just a couple of highlights from the analysis.
Well, I'll also
And
just say that I'm going to link all your videos below that you've
yeah,
got several videos on this,
right.
one or two with Dieter himself, actually.
Yeah. Yeah, that's about the
Yeah,
Edfu temple, right? So Dieter had a
and,
voice
and
issue.
and
Uh,
papers published on this as well. So I'll link all that. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Dieter had a voice issue, and so he asked me to present his lecture to the ARCE, which is the American, what is it, a research center in Egypt. And so they have different chapters, and so this is the Northern California chapter. There's two in California, one where I live here in Southern, and then there's a Northern, which is associated with Berkeley University, and they hosted. I basically set up this presentation, and it ended up being a Zoom presentation because Dr. Kort medically couldn't come here, and then he had a voice problem, so he couldn't even do the Zoom thing, and then I did it for him. He basically sent me the talk, and then I recited exactly what he had written in that presentation, and it's really a nice introduction to the Edfu Temple that Dr. Kort put together.
Yeah.
And it was just a pleasure. I mean, to be able to do it for him, I was very honored to be able to do that for him.
Oh,
And then
yeah.
we had a nice little discussion afterwards with him and me and the audience. So it was really a nice experience. Yeah.
Yeah, well, as I first started coming across this and recognizing it, that there's something to these Edfu texts speaking about Atlantis or something very similar, I started looking into it. And I remember posting something on Facebook. I said, like, what is the best English translation of the Edfu building text they're called?
Yeah.
And you were the one who popped up and you said, Trevor, I'm about to bring it in a couple months or in a couple
Yeah.
of weeks at that point, actually, you
Right.
told me. And I was just dying to see this because,
Yeah.
oh my God, it could not be more important than the
It,
original Egyptians' own
right.
story of their own origins. I just got to hammer
Right.
that point in.
I have to tell you, it's not an easy text to read, even though it's really simple phrases and, exclamations and stuff like that.
Very
But
cryptic.
yeah, but it kind of reads like a theater script. It's almost like stage instructions. It's not a story like in a storybook. It's more like a stage play. And it's staged like a conversation between the gods, and then there's really short scene settings, and it's kind of an interesting read.
Well,
Just
it kind of feels like a riddle almost. Even
it
if
feels
once
like
you get the
yes,
actual text, it's still just like, what did I
yeah.
just read? Which we'll get
Right.
into here.
Yeah. And so when I saw that, I realized that if I translate it, I'm going to refrain from interpreting the text in that paper because I didn't want to bias people in terms of what I'm thinking all of this means. I stayed clear of that. In a discussion, I put a little bit of the idea of resurrection, the Osirian influence on the text. I put that in the discussion, but the translation itself is just as close to the original as I even left out articles, conjunctions for the most part. I was trying to minimize any additional modern interpretations. Like in modern languages, we have all kinds of words that we use to explain things better, like the articles and conjunctions and pronouns and whatever. So, anyways, I kept it simple, and so there were a couple of highlights I want to mention right now. The first thing is that Eve Raymond herself recognized that story, the Memphite creation story, is actually a story of resurrection, and that's a key point because you're wondering, well, what is being resurrected? And so that links it back to another cosmogony, which is called the Hermopolitan cosmogony. That's the Thoth and the Ogdoad story, right? So that's the island of fire, that's the lotus, that's the release of the sun, right? And so somehow something happens to that original cycle, and it ends up being destroyed, flooded. And from the flooded remains of that original cycle is the mythified creation story, and so it's a resurrection story. The Osirian theme that imbues that story is part of the evidence for that. It's a resurrection story, and then the other theme is, and this is crucial for Edgar's Cayce fans, for Hall of Record fans, right? Is that it's based on written creation words. So when Ptah recreates the lost world, he uses recorded personified creation words, and they're called Jaisu. They are mentioned in the title of the creation story. And so this is extremely important that it's not oral tradition, it's written tradition. The Egyptians believed that creation is intimately tied to the written word. And why? Because they thought the writing is alive. They thought hieroglyphs are not just, something you scribble onto papyrus. No, they thought when you chisel a symbol into the wall, that it becomes alive. And so that means you just created something that's alive. Okay, that's an
Yeah, that was,
extremely
I mean, called like the word of God back then, or magic. It was
yeah,
magic to be able to
yeah,
write something down, I would say. And
yeah, that's right. Meduneter. That's right.
um,
And and then
yeah,
and Ptah. Mhm.
maybe you could also mention as you're getting into this side of things, what some of the sources that are cited in the text where it says that that text actually came from too. If you want to, while you're close to that subject, if you want to touch on that.
You mean what the story says where the text came from? Oh, from Mahit. Yeah, from the Great
But
Flood.
on the part of the outer wall there, you're showing there's one section where it says this writing comes from
Yeah,
these
yes,
things.
yes, exactly. Well, so it's amazing, right? We just talked about Mahit, we just talked about the lioness that's guarding Royal Archives records, right? And here in the Edfu text, we're talking about creation now, and what does it say? It's a facsimile of written records, okay, based on the sayings of the Jaisu of the great Mahit. Okay, so it all fits together, right?
Beautifully connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And of course, the Great Mahit in this case is the Great Flood. So the Great Mahit, it's the same word, the same name, but in this context, it's basically referring to the Great Flood. So
Yeah,
the
we
the
didn't even mention that in the first part that Mahit, one of the words associated with Mahit is flood or
yes,
which I just mentioned in this film I did about Australia too, where they
yeah,
go and the
right,
Gosford glyphs in Australia use the symbol of
yeah,
Mahit, the lioness, to
right.
describe the storm that sank their ship that shipwrecked them in Australia. So
Yep, that's right. So you can just imagine, right? Like prehistoric people came to the era Giza, and it was still, it was still it was more flooded. It was a wetter regime, and maybe they found a statue that was partially flooded. It's possible, right? And so that's what it's based on. They associated this statue of a lioness with flooding, and that's where this whole conflation comes from, right? The
or
Mahit.
maybe they built it right after the flood as a memorial to the flood or something like that. Yeah.
Something like that, right? And so the creation words are extremely important because it associates recreation with you have to have written records. And if you go to Esna, on the front of the Esna temple, it says Osiris in his cavern is buried with the Jaisu, with the creation words, right? So it means that resurrection, which is associated with Osiris, can only happen if you have records of the prior cycle that you are about to resurrect. Okay. If you look at New Kingdom, if you look at, for example, Thutmose III, you walk into the burial chamber in the fifth and sixth hour of the Amduat, which is when resurrection occurs. All of a sudden, the orthography becomes complex. You see the hieroglyphs, right? The Amduat, the hours, right? All of a sudden, you have complex writing, enigmatic writing. So see this idea and the way that the hours are mapped onto the wall of the burial chamber is a loop. It's just fascinating. You have hours 1, 2, 3, 4, and then all of a sudden you loop back 5 and 6, and then you loop back over here again 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, right? As if the ancient Egyptians conceptualized resurrection with going back in time. Okay. So you go back in time, you write differently, the language changes, right? And so it's almost like they, to them, resurrection had something to do with turning back time and reciting certain words. And when you did that, you were able to resurrect. And this is really what Ptah does in the Memphite creation story, right? And so and then you have all these parallels with Timaeus in Plato, because what does the demiurge in Plato do? He takes an original that he cannot sense it, he has to reason it. He has to reason it out, right? So he reasons out the characteristics of this original creature that he calls it, and then he fashions from that a copy, which it becomes our cosmos with the gods, with the orbits, with the soul, with animals and people and everything, right? And so that structure, to have an original and you make from that a copy, is extremely Egyptian, because right, we have the original, which is the sky, the astronomy, and the copy is the temple. The temple itself is an image of the universe, as above, so below. And you're one of the best people to know this, right? This doctrine of Hermetic principles. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's the same structure, right? So in Plato Timaeus, and that's why I'm saying we're not just talking about details of Atlantis. That, I know Atlantis hunters, they look at Plato, they look at the exact description, and then they go look for Atlantis, and that's fine. But when we're saying that Plato didn't lie, that he got the story from Egypt, we're not talking about the details of what Atlantis looks like for the most part. What we're talking about is the whole entire structure of the dialogues. The whole entire structure is a typically Egyptian structure. It's not a Greek structure.
Yeah.
Before Plato, the Greeks thought about creation, the cosmogony, as two gods mating, having children. It's a very anthropomorphic type of was it Hesiod or I can't remember, Hesiod. And then all of a sudden Plato comes, and then he comes with this extremely mental, abstract type of creation, which is basically logos, right? It's an intelligent creator that reasons out something, and then he creates a copy from it, and that's what we find at the Edfu temple. And then yes, there are some details, and of course you mentioned this already. Like, for example, I asked myself, okay, if we want to prove that Plato truly used an Egyptian template for his dialogues, and of course he mentions Atlantis and all these Athens, right? Can we actually find the name Atlantis in the Edfu text, right? I said it's just like, remember when I was looking at the jaw sign, I'm going to have to take this to the next step. I have to actually show that this means key or opener. I have to try my best to prove it. This is the same thing. I said people will ask me this. They will saying, okay, fine, but show me the money. What is the
Yeah.
money? What's this? And when I was on stage, you didn't see this. When I was on stage in Sedona presenting, with Graham sitting there, I stood in front of them. I saying, "What is it that you want to see?" And they didn't say we want to see Atlantis, because they didn't expect that I had the goods. And then I pulled out two aces, and I'm saying, "I have the pocket aces.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely.
I have the
You're
pocket aces."
making a few things here now, that like,
Yeah,
I mean, before we get too far from a couple of things I was just mentally making notes of is well, for one thing, we never explained in the last episode that the jaw sign was actually named after John Anthony West, which is
yeah,
brilliant because it's naming a hieroglyph that means key, and John West was the key
yes,
originally to discovering all
right.
about Sphinx.
Right. We
That's one
all
quick
agreed
point.
immediately. That was my idea, and I proposed it to Robert and Robert Bouval and Robert Schock, and they immediately agree. Yes, we got to
Of
do this.
course. And that
Yeah.
was one of my favorite parts of your whole saga with
Hmm.
that.
Yeah.
Because obviously John Anthony West deserves so much credit for all of this, getting it all started. I mean, he got Graham started, he got Shock started, everyone else, he set them on that path. Part of what you're saying too is about building from a previous, building a copy of an earlier cycle again. It reminds me just of the not only the inscriptions on the walls of all the tombs that have the hours of the duat you're passing through, but also the scrolls, the Book of the Dead, the books that were kept with the pharaohs, uh,
Right.
and which I've always seen such a close tie to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, for instance, where it's not inscribed on the walls or on these tombs, but it's read, it's recited aloud to the deceased body, as if to
Hmm.
keep reminding them of what they're moving towards or what they're moving through and how to get
Hmm.
through these barriers. And we know the duat is this whole labyrinth of passwords and secret, things you need to learn in life to be able to get through this whole obstacle course of the soul in order to ascend. And amazing, very, very intricate cosmology of this entire other world that you have to work through. And one last quick thing I was going to say too before moving into more of this stuff about Plato and how that corresponds was that there was also one part in it where it was talking about the source that had to do with a specific book that they said like descended from the sky in a certain area. Uh,
Right.
yeah, could you
That's on the
add a little
that's
bit?
on the that's on the inscription band at the bottom level. So you can it's about your hip level when you're at the north wall of the interior side of the enclosure wall on the north side, and then you walk and then you're reading from the middle to either there's two different texts, right? One going east, one going west. So this is the western half, and you read, and then at the end of that, in the corner with the west wall, that's when that is mentioned.
Okay, yeah, awesome. So that's
Hmm.
very interesting. I think that passage it said something to the effect of this story comes from the original ancient sources, like ancestors of that were here, plus also this
Yeah,
book that descended north of
but
this or something, which is
it's a,
like I'm
it's
not going to
strange.
jump straight to like, okay, this book came down from the sky. Was that
Yeah,
in a ship
that's
or
right.
something? But that's kind of what it sounds like to
That's
me.
kind of what it sounds like. Yeah. It's
Yeah. So
a book that fell from the sky, right?
I
It's
mean, we know about the Vimanas. We know about the
Mhm.
Sumerians called them Shimanas, these flying ships that are described in the Vedas and things.
Mhm.
That is something that's there, people,
Yeah,
But yeah, we don't, it's still somewhat vague, but it's like, what else could that really mean? A book that came out of the sky,
yeah,
ended?
yeah. Well, whatever you want to interpret it is the most important thing about it is that the Edfu texts are telling us that they are not original writing; they're copies of older texts. That's what this is saying.
Yeah, and like you highlighted as well, we've got friends I've seen have come to both of us saying, oh, this was basically it was a noble lie. It was the Greeks were in Egypt and they were trying to make it look like Plato was right. So they inscribed this whole thing. It's like, no, I mean, the thing is saying
No,
right here, this was copied from something ancient. This is the
yeah,
original story. Yeah.
before Plato. Yeah.
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 So,
This is it's too bad. And I don't know. I don't want to accuse modern archaeologists of westernizing ancient Egypt because they know better now. In the old days, yes, in the old days, people have been trying to westernize ancient Egypt for centuries, right? I mean, it goes all the way back to the early Christian apologists, right? They were trying to basically Christianize ancient Egypt, and but I'm not saying just the Christian. It's all kinds of cultures, ideologies, blah blah blah. They're trying to say that their ideas came before ancient Egypt, and it's just the opposite. Okay, the evidence is pretty clear that logos, the act of creation through the utterance of words, is an Egyptian idea, original Egyptian idea, because they came first. They
that's
invented this
the
first.
first words of the book of Genesis. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's right. And let there be light.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Atum, I think, is related to, Atum in Egyptian, Adam in the Bible, the atom,
yeah,
the actual physical atom, which is the first building block of all material existence.
yeah.
There's correlations
So
right
I,
across there.
so I don't want to, I'm not trying to say that the Abrahamic religions are copying or, plagiarizing. I'm not trying to put this in a negative spin. What I'm saying is that the ancient Egyptians came up with these concepts before any evidence that we have from Abrahamic religions. Okay,
Yeah.
so they get seniority on in my book,
Yeah.
right?
Well, it might
Now,
even be supporting them to some degree to say they
yeah,
were copies of this older story, though through the
right,
ages they've been
yeah,
misinterpreted and things have been
right,
mistranslated. But
right.
why we should look to the original source, of course. Yeah.
That's right, exactly. Yeah, it's just a reminder, right, that if we want to know the most the most ancient version of the story, we should look at the Egyptian text,
Mhm.
right? And of course, yes, I mean, the Christian Bible has a flood myth, right? The Quran refers to, refers to it. So that's fine. And they may all be referring to the same events. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying it's the first version of all of this. And the most important thing is logos, because that's the act of creation. That's an Egyptian invention. They came up with this first. And the most important part of that is that it's based on written words. These are inherited records based on which creation occurs, and that is what makes resurrection possible, right? That's an extremely important idea, and that is a typical ancient Egyptian theme.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, and definitely again, you can see that into the Bible. The word was first and the word pierced through the darkness and
Yeah.
where creation
Well,
began.
look,
Vibration,
Trevor.
sound, yeah.
Look at the Ten Commandments, right? The Ten Commandments are written words,
Yeah.
passed down, so the Bible says, from God to Moses. Moses brings it down in the Ark of the Covenant, right?
Yeah.
And those words are the laws of human civilization. That is what forms civilization. Now, when you look at Plato, a lot of people, people read Plato's dialogues and they focus on the Atlantis story, but there's actually a really important theme, and that is has to do with written laws, because Solon actually published written and a softer version of the much more draconian laws that had been published prior to that. Written, tablets with the laws, and these were and they were initially issued by Draco. That's why it's called draconian laws. And a lot of the punishments were bloody, like people lost their lives for some crimes that you would never think should be punishable by death. And
Yeah.
then Solon came and he reformed all of this, right? So Solon was a lawgiver. And interestingly, when you look at the dialogues, there's actually two different two different societies here battling each other. Like in Atlantis, you have 10 kings, right? The descendants of Poseidon, and they get together and they ritualize with this bloody ritual, bull killing, right? They ritualize this orichalcum column that has the precepts of Poseidon on it, right? So that is so, but it's so basically the society of Atlantis, the structure was organized by the written words of Poseidon, the precepts of Poseidon, okay? And
Yeah.
then in Athens, you have the written laws by the same token, right? And
Yeah.
so you had two competing societies. One was a kingdom, and where you had the king basically ruling by the word of the by the written word of God, Poseidon. And then you had the Athenians, who had this structure of society where the military was shielded from corruption, and that's why they were able to prevail over Atlantis. That's what Socrates is saying. If you make a city-state based on the military being isolated from material corruption, you will prevail in any situation, in any war. You will prevail because you have honor, right? The soldiers are honorable. They're not going to be corrupted by bribes and stuff like that, right? And
Yeah.
so because when Plato grew up, when Plato was born, Greece was in the middle of a civil war, and that was a bloody, corrupt, nasty civil war. It was the Peloponnesian War, right? And there was bribes going on. There were behind the scenes dealings. It was not a noble war, right? And so the Greeks were aching for the old days when wars were still fought nobly, right? And so here comes Socrates is saying, what we need to do is we need to structure a society with an honorable military. That means we have to provide the military from the other society, so the other strata of society, so that the military is shielded from corruption, right? And then you have Atlantis, where you have the kings ruling. The kings are drafting the people, right? In Athens, you have the soldiers. Actually, there's a guild of soldiers, right? It's a completely different society system, and that's why Athens prevails over Atlantis. That's really the political point that Plato is trying to make. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, there's a couple things to say there for yeah, like you say, like Solon, he became this ruler of Athens for a time, but then it was like he reformed so much, from my understanding at least, it was that he he was the people's ruler. Like he was the one,
Yes,
he canceled all these debts. He like reformed
that's right.
everything. And so the people loved him, but a lot of the nobility did not. Like the elites today would not like
Right.
one coming in
Exactly.
and disturbing their system. And that he kind of ruled for a time and then just kind of got jaded with it. He was like, "Man, I'm not I'm done with this. All right, you guys all hate me for doing what's right." Which is why he left Greece and went to Egypt and sought out this higher knowledge, this deeper memory of our
Hmm.
history. And
Right.
that's what actually drew him there. And then meeting with these priests of Sais is, for people who don't know, this was Solon was the one who actually went and recovered the story of Atlantis from Egypt and then brought it back. And I've heard
Right.
taught it to his own grandson who told it to Plato or something like that.
Right.
And that he was all of this does set a kind of stage for an argument that all of this was really maybe could have been just a metaphor to describe what an ideal state would look like and how to achieve a government that could actually maintain peace and enlightenment and a just form of civilization where everyone is actually progressing in a way they should be. And why not look to Egypt when you're looking at that? Because they had a system in place where it's like the pharaoh, the rulers actually had a reason to be benevolent and to treat their subjects just if they wanted to make it through this duat that they truly believed in, whether or not we do. They did believe that Anubis is going to weigh their heart against a feather, and if they didn't treat their subjects properly, they're not going to make it to the ascension process. So there's actually a motivation built into the society in Egypt that motivated the leaders to run a just society, which is
Yes.
exactly opposite of today's world, where
That's right.
corruption is rewarded and
Yeah.
nobody has any reason to care about the world they leave behind. And I think
Right.
it's such a central theme of what Plato is saying. So I also understand why some people could say, "Oh, this was a noble lie. He's just trying to." Make an example for the Greeks to follow that would be, an example of a actual righteous or just society. But it also ties to something I meant to mention in the last episode, the last interview when we were talking about it, that because we were talking about the potential heliocentric theory being represented even in the original island of Atlantis and the concentric rings of canals. Um, and I'm wondering if you ever have heard of the book, The Pythagorean Plato by Ernest McLean.
No.
This was a book that John West, he insisted I read this one. It was very obscure, not very well known, but Ernest McLean was a really brilliant, I mean, getting into the math and the geometry and looking into this, and much like the book Hamlet's Mill, which puts forward this theory, this fact, as far as I can see it, that these ancient myths were all encoding these numbers and an entire
Hmm.
science within their metaphors that they placed within them. But the Pythagorean Plato, it's basically making a case that Plato was encoding into the myth of Atlantis all these this science of harmony and proportion and music, like the music of the spheres kind of thing is basically woven into it, which does not eliminate the possibility that it is also a historical text, which he did put it forward as. He said Solon did bring us this story from Egypt, and they did say this was real. And so this also, I mean, that's a really, really important book, I think, in terms of showing that this advanced sacred science, as we call it, was present in that very early time.
Yeah.
And but it certainly does not discount the fact that it was put forward as a historical, story about this island culture that emigrated there and that they were fighting the Greeks at one point. The Athenians actually held off the negative, the darkly oriented Atlanteans that fell into this corruption when they came attacking Europe. This is what the priests of Sais are telling to Solon when he comes there. They're like, "You Greeks don't even know. You were part of the defense league against when the Atlanteans went bad."
Right.
And saying like we consider you our sister city of Athens because
Yes.
basically Athena was an equivalent to them of Neath, I believe it was. They're
Hmm.
their own patron goddess. So they told Solon like, yeah, we'll tell you the truth. You guys don't even remember one flood. We remember a bunch of them.
Right.
Taking him into these special places and showing them all this, um, which kind of
E
pulled it back around to kind of where we were at before too. And I was going to say also, we never quite got your pair of aces in your pocket there about how the actual name Atlantis is found at the temple. Uh,
yeah.
so yeah,
Well,
maybe we could go back to that quick.
the irony is, what you just said, right? You have Solon uh, going to Egypt and hearing about written records that tell the Atlantis story, and then Solon, what does he do? He goes back to Greece, and does he write it down? No. It turns out he tells it's oral tradition, right? He's still after being told that you Greeks forget everything because you don't have written records, right? Because they keep getting destroyed, whatever. What does he do? Does he write these things down? No, he still tells Dropidas. Dropidas tells Critias the elder, and then that gets passed on to Critias the younger, who then tells the story to
Yeah,
Socrates and Hermocrates and Timaeus, right? So have the Greeks learned their lesson? No.
yeah.
They're still talking about history instead of writing it down, right?
Well,
And so
yeah, that's part of a. I mean,
that's the
there's an argument for not starting to write things down because then you lose that this ancient hermetic magical kind of memory techniques and things.
fine.
Um,
That's
like
okay. But I
yeah,
mean, if you make the case, look, you kids, right? You don't know it. You have amnesia. You don't remember anything because you don't have any written records. If you make that point, well, then you ought to be following your own advice,
maybe
right?
think about doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, you should be.
Well,
So
that
Plato was probably the first one who said, "Okay, I'm gonna have to write this down, what
yeah,
I inherited." And what is it that he inherited? Well, he inherited, I believe, okay, based on Graham's analysis and my take on this, is that he inherited a structure, a basic story structure, and then he may have filled in some of the details, and that actually is a way to reconcile this interpretation with what the classicists are saying. Classicists are saying, everything is made up, it's a lie, blah blah blah. And because some of those details don't add up, and I don't have a problem with that. I'm saying, no, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater, right? The baby is the structure of the story, and that looks to me it came from it's an Egyptian structure, it's not a Greek structure.
yeah,
The whole entire Timaeus creation, that's Egyptian, that's Memphite, that's not a Greek invention. Logos, everything, right? And so I think the compromise here is that Plato got a back of the envelope structure. He got a few names, and I'm going to get into the Atlantis in a moment. And then he filled in, he basically he adapted this for his own audience, which is the Greeks, right? Plato himself also wanted to make a statement to the Greeks. He wanted to say, look, this is what works and this is what doesn't work. What works is a stratified society where the military is shielded from material corruption, right? And in ancient Athens there were these big discussions about whether the money should be invested in a army or if it should be invested in a navy. So they were, and a navy, of course, were being represented by Atlantis, and the army being represented by the Athenian hoplites, right? And so they had these political discussions. And so, anyways, part of a really important clue in the Atlantis story is that and Critias is the one who's recounting this. He's saying that Solon translated the names that he heard in Egypt back into the Greek original. Okay. And that's an important clue because it means that you're never going to find the Greek names in an Egyptian text. You're going to find the Egyptian version of that name, right? And so when I saw that, I immediately realized that I have to look for, if I want to see Atlantis, I have to look for what the Egyptians would have referred to it, and it has to be in the right context too, right? I mean, I just can't I can't just pick some word and saying, okay, this is what I think is the Egyptian word for Atlantis in Greek, but then it's talking about a recipe to make a precious oil, right? That doesn't make any sense. So it has to be at part of a creation story, part of an island, blah blah blah. And lo and behold, this is what happens. Okay, the breakthrough discovery I realized is when I looked at Manetho's king list, because you know the Manetho dynasties, right? He's the one who defined the 30 dynasties of ancient Egypt. And we don't have Manetho's writing in original. We have references to it from later historians. They refer to Manetho. And so they cite him. And among the second dynasty kings is a king called Talas, which is a bizarre way to refer to Wagenes, because that's the original name is Wagenes. And Manetho turned this into Tlas, which is like Atlas, right? And when I saw that, I'm going, oh my God. So, in other words, the ancient Greeks were not able to express some of the Egyptian sounds. Like there's seven consonants in ancient Egyptian language that didn't have a Greek equivalent. Uh, like, for example, ch or j. Like, remember you said neter. Remember you said that? Well, that sound doesn't have a Greek equivalent. So it turns out that what Manetho did, he substituted this j sound for TL. And that's so we have that. We know that he did it because we have the entry. We have Wagenes and we have Tlas, right? And so when I saw that, I realized that's it. You gotta look for a word that has a j in it. If you want to find Atlantis, it's not TL, it's j. And so one thing leads to another, and so I'm basically in two steps, which follows etymological rules. And the important rule also is one that was discovered by Robert Beeks. So Robert Beeks is a Dutch linguist that is passed away now. But what Robert Beeks did, he looked at Greek words, ancient Greek words. He looked at the way they're constructed, and he was able to list about 1,300 ancient Greek words that are not Greek that the Greeks inherited from another culture, and it's not an Indo-European culture. So he was able to clearly identify that these endings and this word construction is not Indo-European. So it came from another culture. For example, a Semitic language culture, right? And so, and the and one part of this word chemistry is the ending "ant." So what Robert Beeks published in his Ancient Greek dictionary is that the ending "ant" was added to these pre-Greek words, right? So that it marks basically that and there's other endings as well, but this particular ending marks a word as being pre-Greek, and that makes perfect sense, right? Because the Egyptian word would have long predated the Greek language at that point. So based on these two findings that j becomes TL and there has to be an ant ending, I went from ujat to atlant. Okay, even though you may think, well, those are two different words, it's actually a very simple conversion, and I'm not making up the rules. Those are etymological rules that
There's a
we
precedent.
have. Yeah, there's a precedence, exactly, right. And then the third question is that word ujat mentioned in a context appropriate way? And of course it is. It is mentioned in the context of the island of Ra, the round arrival site, okay, the primordial capital of the gods. Okay, how much better does it get? Okay, it is Atlantis, right? It's the Poseidon's island that he carved the canals in around the mountain. It's a round place, right? Which is what you just pointed out, which could be a symbol, a talisman of the heliocentric solar system, right? Which I agree with you. I think that is very possible that is a symbol and a stylized symbol of a knowledge that was lost at the time.
Yeah, well, I think the
Yeah,
Pythagorean Plato as well hammers that point in as well. And the
mm,
Hermetic texts themselves, which I think I mentioned it in the first part of this a little bit, but the city of Attocentin is mentioned in the Hermetic text as the
yeah,
city of the sun. That's what it was called. It was like the solar temple in the middle, and then
yeah.
all
That,
concentric canals
that's right.
known. And the four
Yeah,
directions marked by, just like the same as the Book of Revelations, also is using the
right.
four figures that are the lion, the bird, the man, and the bull, the
Yep,
four cardinal or fixed directions of the zodiac. All of this astrological
right.
framework as well as a you know planetary solar system model, basically.
Right. Now, so see, now people are going to say, Trevor, I predict this. People are going to say, Manu, Plato himself is proposing the spindle of Ur. right? Which is the myth of Ur. That's a fascinating story where he actually saying it's the earth is in the center, right? So how is it that you're saying now, you guys are saying now that Atlantis is a symbol of heliocentrism, right? Well, that's because he inherited the story from Egypt.
Well, yeah, the solar temple was in the middle. It was the solar
Yeah,
temple. It wasn't the earth temple. That's not what
no,
they said. And
yeah,
what
that's
came
right.
up in these later generations in the
Yeah,
Renaissance and stuff, they're all
yeah,
working back to that. Where the mystery schools, even as late as the Renaissance, they're saying we're going to resurrect this Hermetic goal of building this and the Platonic philosopher's city, and all of that was tied
yeah,
with the mystery schools. It was the eventual goal to rebuild an enlightened world, global society that was on a
right.
path of peace and enlightenment. So yeah, absolutely. And God, I just love that that you absolutely could not have made that up. No, the word Atlantis, its predecessor, is there on the wall of Edfu, people.
It is.
Listen,
And it's
Manu is the
something
one who brought that forward.
And something that you said also, this is really important what you mentioned about the Platonic solids and the geometric structure of the universe, right? That is what Ptah represents. Ptah is the artisan patron, the patron god of the artisans, right? The people that take matter and shape it into structure, into sculpting, right? Into
Art
all
is
these things.
creation. Yeah.
It's creation, that's right. And so the whole Ptah angle here is that you have a plan, you have a concept, and then you shape that concept into an actual manifestation, a physical manifestation. And that is how Ptah creates. He has a concept, right? And those the facilities are the distant idea and then the focused concept, and that's represented by the Sheptiu, the far and the great. Okay. And then the Sheptiu weave this concept into a perch for Horus to sit on, and then they transfer it to the place of Earth in the later part of the story, and they take creation matter, which is in Egyptian is called Aichet. Aichet means matter, and Dieter Kort and this is actually where Dieter Kort draws a parallel to Plato. He's saying Aichet in Egyptian, that is the equivalent of the Platonic solids. Okay, so that's Kort saying it. That's not me saying it. That's Dieter Kort saying it, and
Well,
he has that published. Okay, and so see, this is a completely new philosophy of creation that Plato all of a sudden comes up with. Okay. And so did this come out of Greek tradition? No, it didn't. Pythagoras, yes, Pythagoras drew geometry and everything, but even Pythagoras, people saying he got that from Egypt, right? People, the idea of Pythagorean triangles and music and all of that, this is an Egyptian concept. And so this whole thing about original cosmos and copy of cosmos, how did the ancient Egyptians conceptualize this? They to them, if you want to bring the heaven down to earth and you want to build a copy of the sky on earth, you have to conceptualize the sky with geometry, sacred geometry, right? That's what the temple is. The temple, the Egyptian temple, is the copy of the sky on earth. And you can't obviously make it an exact copy. It's the earthly version of the sky. Of course, the sky is round, right? Black holes are round, the universe is round, everything is round, right? How are you going to represent circles with corner temples, right? And that's the whole thing. The translation of the sky involves geometry and music. Everything that you said, Trevor, it rings true because that's how you get it concretely in front of you, and that's architecture and that's music and everything, and that's what the Egyptians figured out how to do.
yeah, yeah, very much tied into what John West has always said that the temples are constructed, the sacred science is built on knowledge
Yes,
of vibration,
yes,
whether it's sound or light or just the actual stones, reverberations, sympathetic resonance with the temples themselves. When you as a body are in there, it's actually affecting you physically, which affects you emotionally and mentally and spiritually. To these temples are actually they're emitting these vibrations that come and affect you, just like a painting you see. It's the light hitting you, or a concert you hear, you're emotionally affected by, or the view from a mountaintop. It's all vibrations that are coming into your senses that end up being interpreted. So it's
Are you building a segue to satellite scanning right now of resonant voids?
oh, am I? No, actually, I was working on a segue to something else
Sorry.
that we can go on as long as we want today. I'll remind you
No,
that.
I know, I know. No, I'm just
But
kidding.
yeah, no, actually I was gonna start pulling it in. We've been going about an hour on this one, and maybe we can pull it towards looking at some images of this because we're already kind of maybe getting ahead of ourselves talking about the correlations to Plato before really speaking a little bit about what the actual content of the Edfu building text is itself. Though, it's we discussed a little bit, but basically it is the story of Atlantis in some form, or very similar to the material that Edgar Cayce did say about this, that at this time these Atlantean immigrants were flooding into Egypt after the flood. And yeah, we're speaking about the flood in general. We do have 200 or so flood myths from around the whole world from all different cultures. We could go, there's so many of them that have so many specific similarities from, non cultures that were not in contact with each other according to the narrative we have, which is obviously crazy because they're building these same pyramids over here and there. It's like, come on, but um yeah, I was also going to quick say something like John also always told me to look into G.I. Gurdjieff, and he was a mystic, Armenian mystic philosopher, and was searching deep into these ancient mysteries. And he also, his father was a record keeper who would tell him, oral tradition record keeper, who would tell him the story basically of Gilgamesh when he was a child. And he would hear that story of the flood and Utnapishtim, the Sumerian account, and that was before the Gilgamesh tablets had been discovered. And then they
Hmm.
discovered the tablets, and he remembers these
Hmm.
tablets that were discovered were practically word for word the story that his father had told him as a boy. So
Fascinating.
that
Hmm.
is amazing. And he talked in
Hmm.
some of his talks that he gave to his students and things that are recorded in some books about these memory techniques, how you can keep that alive. And in general, when you start writing stuff down, then you start losing this ability to remember like you could have. But he really explains that it's more about observation in the moment. If you observe well while you're there, then you can remember better when you're trying to look back to it.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe I could ask you to give a little bit of a summary of what the actual content of the building text is in terms of what do they actually say about this island and who came from there and
Okay. Let
yeah.
me share my screen so I can give you an overview. So send request. Okay.
Okay.
And then let's go to, so what I've done here, Trevor, is to basically map these cosmogonal texts onto the walls of the Edfu temple. Can you see this?
Yep.
Okay, so first I want to acknowledge that this is a SketchUp model by Andre Lopez. I think he's an architect. He put this up on SketchUp, and this is a screenshot of this mobile model. And so what I've done is map records according to Eve Raymond onto the walls based on Chassinat's entries, obviously, and then I looked at, of course, the German translations to understand what the texts are saying. And to answer your question, so this is the naos, this is the sanctuary, this is the pronaos, the foretemple. And here on the west wall of the naos is where you have the story of the island of fire. So this is the first cycle of creation with the pond on the island of fire, with the lotus that emerges from the pond, and then with the sun that shines the first ray of light through the darkness of the chaotic origins of existence. Okay, and of course the primordial gods of the Ogdoad are the Ogdoad, the eight gods, the snakes and frogs, the four couples, and they represent the original forces of nature. And then what happens is that somehow this island goes under, and we know this from the pyramid text. We talked about themes that are much older than the Edfu temple itself, the temple I'm saying, the theme of this, you can find it in the pyramid text of Unas, where it says that the island of fire is in chaos, and Unas recreates order, and then there's a great flood. And this is all mentioned and I have this in the video where I discuss all of that, so we don't have to get into details, but these are all old themes. And then here we go to the north wall. This is what we've been talking about. That's the Memphite creation mythology, and this is a resurrection now of this original island of fire. And now here is now Ptah that's reciting the creation words, the Jaisu, in order to effect this recreation by virtue of logos. And logos meaning, of course, creating by utterance. Then what happens, the later part of this creation story, it talks about the creation of earth, okay? And that is expanded upon here on the west wall. So here, the sequence of the text is describing the settlement on the primordial island, the Pite Island, the securing of it, and then the court stretching to plan the temple, to survey the temple site, and then the layout of the temple on the ground. So no building yet. This is all planning. So all of this on the west wall is planning. And then there's a bridge, a textural bridge from the west to the east wall. And here now you have the actual making of the temple on the potter's wheel. So the taking shape of the temple is here on the east wall, and that's basically these text segments over here. There's the invention of the cubit, the sculpting of the temple, as I said, the interior design with the chambers and everything, and then there's the inauguration of the temple. This is all here on the east wall. And then the remaining text, which is over here and over here, that has to do with two other sites, apparently. So Graham mentioned this in Magicians of the Gods. He's saying there's sort of a diaspora. So the recreators, so in other words, the surviving the gods that recreate the world, some of them spread out to other sites, and they found separate locations. And one of them is Heracleopolis over here mentioned, and then here there's another site, another temple that's being built that is dedicated to Tatenen. And so that's the overall mapping of all the text. And so now I asked myself, so this took a long time, Trevor, to figure this out. This is not easy because, like I said, the texts are, one difficulty which I realized is that the way that the texts are surveyed is actually from south to north. So even Dieter Kort, he's using Chassinat's transcription sequence, and that goes from south to north. But it's interesting, the mythological texts are actually written in a north to south fashion. So they are separating themselves, distinguishing themselves by being read in the opposite direction. And when I saw that, and this is based on Fairman, who translated the myth of Horus and Set, which is on the second register, and he noted that the text should be written from north to south. And so when I saw that, I realized that these texts, by the same token, also makes much more sense. The logical sequence is to read them from north to south, right? So this way and that way. And so then I asked myself, well, why are these texts spread out over the west and the east wall? Why isn't this all in one place? And that takes me to what you were asking me about, to tell you, to explain. It has to do with the way that the sun hits the temple walls. So the way that you're supposed to read the text is with the sun. So, and the breakthrough, the realization came when I saw that this text over here, where it says securing against Apophis, that text begins with a sunrise, a mention of a sunrise. And I'm going, well, that's on the west wall. How does that make sense? And then I realized that is because the morning sun, which is over here in the east, illuminates the west wall, not the east wall, right? The east wall is still shaded, the interior, I'm saying, in the morning. The east wall becomes illuminated around noontime. Like, like say the sun is over here. That's when you start seeing the light shine on the east wall. And that was the breakthrough. Then I realized that this is meant to be read with the sunlight, with the course of the sun and the way the sun hits the temple walls. And I mentioned it to Dr. Kort, and Dr. Kort is saying this is an interesting theory, and he's saying that nobody has really looked into this. Only, it's sort of rudimentary ways. Like somebody was looking at the equinox, how it might be encoded by shadows here in the forecourt, but nobody has actually looked at the text, the sequence of text to be read with the sun. So, and so he's interested in the project. And so this is what I started doing a couple of months ago that's why I went to Egypt, to take pictures of how the shadows and how the sunlight develops on the temple walls during the course of a day. Now I have to say that this was late February, of course. So what you really need to do is look at this throughout the whole year, like the solstices, the equinoctial illumination pattern. So you should really, you technically you have to look at this over the whole day. I mean year. So I did it close to springtime, late February, and I am going to show you some. I'm going to let you ask a question. I think I've been talking a lot. So let me just pick up some pictures here.
So awesome. I remember watching you posting some of this stuff about it as that came out, and I'm like, this is so awesome. It's just the
It's mind-boggling. Yeah, I
there's
know.
no there's nothing there's nothing in Egypt that's not intentional. And I believe
Right.
so much that light was so often used, especially sunlight was, there's no unintentional shadows being cast anywhere. Everything was so intentional. When you're dealing with a civilization of geniuses, you have to think in this way. And I've never heard anyone actually look for this type of clues and actually, because there's so many different ways we've already discussed that this text is absolutely just riddled with these codes and things that have to be cracked. It's all a riddle to me, like every one of the temples. And yeah, I think absolutely, it makes a lot of sense to me that at least in some sense the sunlight, how it shines, would be able to indicate which direction you read the passages in, at least.
Yeah. Yeah,
Wow.
I completely agree with you. This is and it's just it's not text. There's also amazing shadow plays in the temple. It's not just text. There's other things too. There's so much, right? I mean, it's like I was like you were saying you feel like you're in a candy store. I was felt like I'm in a candy store. There's so much to discover that has to do with shadowing and lighting in the temple.
Well, there's
And
nothing more exciting than this. I mean, this is the most
yeah,
important stuff on the planet. The fact that you and I are the only ones who are, so excited about this. It's like, I mean, other
I
people
know.
do it, but it's like that. I don't see anything in the world that's near as important as what we're talking about right now. And it's like I'm surprised more people don't
Well,
see it. Find
well,
the dedication to look this close.
yeah. Well, yeah, yeah, that's right. Well, I mean, there's obviously other people have other things to worry about in the world, which I totally understand. But to us, yes. So there's some of us alternative historians and whatever and Egyptologists even they are also interested in this stuff. But
Well,
here, so
it's
here
because
is
it
I don't know if you can see this, but this is an image of the enclosure wall.
Yeah, I was just
Go
gonna say
ahead.
because it's this is something that can actually teach humanity where we came from. Literally,
Yeah,
all
yeah,
culture on this
that's right.
planet is going back to Egypt. Is the original stories? It's all going. I think this knowledge went to many different lands, like you said, and I think there's correspondences between this story and stories in other lands, like the Apkallu of potentially, or even in Vedic history in India and things. But I don't think the records that were taken from this previous cycle of civilization were stored anywhere in more completion and in such great depth as they were in Egypt. And that's literally speaking to the origins of
Right.
humanity and of the very first cultures. And this is ultimately leading to a knowledge of ourselves on a collective level, self-knowledge, not on an individual, but on a collective level for
Right.
all the human race. So how could anything be more important than this? That's my logic, at least.
Right. Yeah, you're right. Yeah. No, I agree. This is early in the morning, 7:30, and look what the first thing that's illuminated is the north wall, the upper register, and there's the Memphite creation story right here. There's Thoth.
There's Thoth writing it down.
Yeah. Isn't that just majestic the way this looks?
Yes.
It's just like, you have to imagine when you're standing in front of it and you just look at this creation story and it's lighting up in the sun. It's just something else. It's so hard to
Yeah.
describe.
Well, the way
I hope,
each register one at a time, it's like read me first. It makes
yeah.
sense what you're saying.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Amazing.
Let me see if I can find the name of Atlantis for you. Uh, that is round arrival side. Where was that? I have it on another slide. I'll show it to you in a moment. So here, for example, now this is the east wall, and now this is. Oh, wait a minute, is it the east wall? No, this is still the north wall. Yeah. Let me show you the west wall because we're in the morning now, and I wanted to show you how these two inscription bands are illuminated in the morning. So it turns out that those three text segments that I told you about, they are either in elongated trans horizontal inscription bands or in vertical inscription bands. And just as expected, the the horizontal inscription bands are the first ones to light up. And I'm just looking for, yeah, I mean, this is an example. See, that is the west wall, and let me see if I can zoom in so you can see. So do you see this band here?
Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah.
this is actually a summary, a synopsis of the creation myth. It begins on the north wall, and this is called uh the inscription band at the top register, and it summarizes the creation story. And this is the first thing that gets illuminated. Okay. And then beneath that it comes the detailed version. Like here, for example, right? So here's the creation myth, right? And then at the end of the creation myth is when the things of earth are mentioned, and the things of earth are then expanded upon right up here in this horizontal inscription line, right? So see, that's the morning sun. It's about, I want to say that's about 8 o'clock in the morning. And there's another example of it. This is a little bit overexposed, so you can't see the text, but it's basically what I did is every hour it took another set of photos. Gradually, obviously, the shadow comes down and the sun illuminates more and more of the wall. And then eventually you see this vertical text here, Trevor? You see this
Yeah.
here? Right. So here is the seven Jaisu. There's the seven creation words, and there's the two Sheptiu, right? And so this text has to do with the planning of the architectural planning of the temple. It mentions all the chambers, the enclosure, the pylon, everything, how everything is supposed to be laid out, but it's not yet actually construction. It's just the plan. And this, all of this starts illuminating around, I want to say 10 a.m., right? So you don't read this until you first read the horizontal text, which has to do with arriving on the island and then doing this court, the court stretching and all of those things. And then at the end is when you finally start planning the temple. And so you asked me about the building text. Well, this is really now the survey of the building of the temple. And let me show you this. This is really important because people have this all you stitching together a story, these text fragments all over the temple, right? But look, just like you said, nothing is left to accident. Right here, it says Shenem uh Per and Neheb. So it says basically building of the temple on the potter's wheel, right? So this phrase over here is a connector phrase that tells us that this text continues now on the other side of the temple. And because that's when you find exactly the same phrase. It says building of the temple on the potter's wheel. And then actually that is what happens. Okay. So, and there is these little clues are incorporated into text that help you to connect these text pieces, right? And so
Amazing.
again, the
Yeah.
reason, yeah, yeah. And the reason why they are spread out like this is not because, of some random reason. No, it's because these texts are associated with the birth of the sun, the creation, the recreation of the sun every single day, which is a memorialization of the recreation story ultimately, right? Because in the first cycle of creation, the sun was born and you had light that was cutting through the darkness of chaos. And then that original cycle is destroyed and flooded, and then it's resurrected. And so, of course, what is resurrected? Well, it's Horus, right? Horus and Ra come back from this earlier cycle because you need light, right? And so this whole entire creation story is really dedicated to the resurrection of light. right? And so what better way to memorialize this than with light?
Yeah, yeah. And it's speaking to like Khnum as well at the Temple of Esna. He's fashioning
Yep,
man on the potter's wheel. It's the potter's wheel is kind of this it's a brilliant symbol actually because it's almost like the Hamlet's mill, the millstone of the Kalevala and the Scandinavian myths and what they get into in that book talking about the millstone being a metaphor of the Earth's axis turning through the slow cycle of precession and repeating this, the next phase of the cycle and recreating the world that was. And that's even speaking more towards the fact that these first migrants coming from this other island to Egypt. I think this gets into another one of the really important themes of it all, which was that they were considered these eternal beings, kind of. They were called the Seven Sages by, at least I think, by Graham and Eve Raymond, and they were calling it that. Which, like I said, could be similar to the Opgalu. Others have suggested that.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Those
Sumerian.
are the seven sages in here in the Edfu text are the seven Jaisu, the creation
Yeah.
words. Yeah,
Yeah, so that's putting them in a category of like an eternal being, immutable
yes,
forces, things outside of time, things that can actually preserve the last world through and build the new world out of them, which
yep,
man, that lines right up with the Mayan and the other things around the world, like the new world, the new humanity was made from the bones of the last one or things like that. Not to mention all the parts of it that are seeming to correspond to this Atlantis story too, but it seems like it's a cycle of resurrection being the processional cycle itself. And maybe the
yeah,
potter's wheel itself is another symbol of the processional cycle, the Earth's North Pole spinning through these different North Stars over time.
yes, yes, right. Yeah.
Yeah, possibly.
So yeah, so I think I mean this is still a project in progress. So I think what needs to be done is to look at this in different seasons to see if there's a seasonal effect. But I think the overall impression I'm getting is that the sunlight was very important in terms of why the texts were mapped out like this.
Yeah. Um, is there anything you can say as well about just touching on how Edgar Cayce's information also corresponds to this? Because he was talking about, well, I would ask you that as well as maybe it's a quicker question to ask first is there's some evidence here that you brought out regarding how this story at Edfu actually corresponds to the timetable used by Plato and Solon and the story of Atlantis he gave.
Yeah,
Maybe let's hit that first. Can you explain how the timetable lines up? Because a lot of
yeah,
people believe they say Plato added an extra zero onto his number, describing
no,
like, oh, he meant 800 years, not 8,000. But
yeah, no,
Plato,
he
who is
didn't.
trusted as the father of science in every other aspect, oh, he probably just added a zero. He made a mistake. Yeah, can we hit that
No, no,
topic?
that's he. Yeah, he didn't make a mistake. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there is a text. There is a ritual, a necklace offering ritual, which I've magnified over here. So this is Ptolemy the Ninth, giving to Rahorachti, this necklace, right? And it has nine bands, which is symbolic of the nine. And in over here behind in the text that describes what Ptolemy is saying, it says that for it's he's say Ptolemy is saying this to Rahorachti, for you are the great god, the prince, the ruler of his residence in these 7,000 years, right? And for anybody who wants to doubt this, so here is yeah, I put a white line over it, but 7,000 is these are each one of the symbols is 1,000. So this is 7,000, right? And then means these. So these and Renput means years. So Renput and then means these years, 7,000. Okay, that's where this comes from. And so
Awesome.
now, how does this fit in? Yeah, well, if there is a there is the easiest way for me to is do this is to illustrate it on the wall, which I did here, right? So I drew a timeline with 81 being when BC becomes AD, so that's 2000 years, 2025 years ago. And so here is the construction of the Edfu temple during these 180 years. Here's the time of Plato's dialogues. That's about let's say 80 years before the Edfu temple was begun to be built, and more than 80 years, sorry. This will be 50 plus 80, 130 years before the Edfu temple construction began. And then here is Solon's visit to Egypt, which is you referred to when you were talking about how Solon recused himself from Egypt after he reissued the Greek laws, right? And so this particular mention here, the reason why I'm putting this over here, in other words, 1600 BC, because that's when Middle Egyptian was phased out. The Middle Egyptian language was phased out around this time, 1600 BC. So if you go back 7,000 years from there, you end up 8600 BC, and that is what Plato says through Critias when the ancient Egyptian civilization begins. So Zeb Tepi, according to Plato, which who speaks through Critias, begins this time, 1,000 years after the war between Atlantis and Athens, which happened 9,000 years. 9,000 years before Solon goes to Egypt, right? So I rounded this up to 600 BC. 9,000 years is approximately 9,600 BC. And 1,000 years later is when the Egyptian civilization begins. And you asked him about Edgar Cayce. Well, Edgar Cayce would say, if he was alive, he may say that this is the restart, right? This is when the Atlanteans come to Egypt and they participate in the what is it? The rule of the one by Ra-Ta, right? Who comes from the Arabia area or something like that with 800 disciples. I can't remember details,
Yeah.
but he
Love
comes to
one.
Egypt and he wants to establish the law of the one, right? And then initially it fails. He's ousted, and then he comes back, and then he's able to successfully install this rule of the one. And during that time, the Atlanteans join after the destruction of Atlantis. And then they built the pyramids and the Sphinx and all of that. And so all of this happens at this time. This is according to Plato now. And so there's a correspondence, in other words, between what the Egyptians themselves believes when they got started and what Plato says when the Egyptians got started, right? Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
you were referring to.
Yeah, so Solon's story's looking pretty good, you know? It's looking
Yeah, it
pretty
looks,
good. And
yeah,
yeah, Rata's love one thing. This is also, I think, is corresponding. It reminds me of Akhenaten coming so much later, where he's got the this single source of the whole universe, the Aten, or he's basically starting monotheism with his stuff. But it's also considered the return to source doctrine, it's been called, where it's, that the entire goal of the for the initiate and for the civilization is to achieve this ascension over this duality where everything is in dual forms, and there's the inner
right,
and outer quality, the water and fire, male, female, and all of the hermetic principles, the seven hermetic concepts they talk about, or every single one of them is just talking about balance, the balancing of the reconciliation of all opposing forces being dealt with. This is the whole story of Horus, reconciling the Osiris and Set and night
yes,
and day, and
right,
everything in Egypt is about balancing, and it's all about balancing the two hemispheres of the brain, really, and
right,
working to open up the third eye that way.
right,
Um, but yeah, there's also parts of the story coming from Edgar Cayce where he's talking about yeah, there were these schools of benevolent Atlanteans who were aware of the impending cataclysms, and they were doing these migrations almost like missionaries, like bringing their knowledge to these different lands. Um, and yeah, it's like we were talking about some of the roots of some of these words as well. I was going to say Ignatius Donnelly. You go back and look at his book, The Antediluvian World, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and he's showing all these words that clearly had a common source coming all over the world. But that's neither here nor there. Casey was talking about the first Atlanteans coming into Egypt being archaeologists themselves. Even back in this first time of Rata, which we could just say, let's call it 10,900, 9,000 BC in that general era. And he said they were archaeologists themselves and that they were seeking out these places that were already ancient. And I think this is what we're talking about when we say primordial mounds. It's meaning these very ancient things. And this starts tying everything together because we know that the Great Pyramid and probably the other two pyramids there as well, they have these mounds that are likely far older than the pyramids themselves. And Edgar Cayce tells us straight up the Great Pyramid was created 10,490 BC to 10,390 BC. So he's pinpointing from a completely different source the exact date, 10,500 BC, basically, that Schock and Bauval and Hancock and John, all the astrological dating points to, all the geological water weathering points to. And so, yeah, we have this story coming from a lot of places. It is again lining up with the basic story Atlantis is giving us that these Atlantean immigrants were coming in and seeking out these primordial mounds that were already in the land of Egypt 12,000 years ago. And basically, it seems like seeking out these, just like you say, rebuilding the new from the old, finding these important sites or locations, and then building the first temples of Egypt on top of them, even though
Hmm.
obviously there were older versions that might not have been pyramids and temples, but at least
Hmm.
these mounds marking important spots. So, yeah, is there anything you could say more about that, how that corresponds, or um,
Yeah, well, there's actually it brings up an important point that I wanted to mention also for your audience, Trevor, because people are going to criticize, what I'm saying, that there is basically the basic structure of Plato's story is at Edfu, and it's an older theme that predates Plato, right? They're going to say, well, you believe in Atlantis, and so you're just trying to prove that Atlantis is real, or you believe in Edgar Cayce's psychic abilities, and you want to say that, psychic abilities are real. And I just want to make sure that, we separate these two things because that's a ploy that the crit it's a shortcut. It's sloppy. Uh, because even if it's true that Plato inherited the story from Egypt, it does not necessarily mean that Atlantis is a real place, right? That's a leap, but that's what the critics are going to come at this in that way. They conflate these two. They conflate two logical steps. The first logical step is, did Plato get the story from Egypt? And what I'm showing here is that yes, he did, right? Then the next step is, well, was Atlantis a real place, right? Did the Island of Fire actually refer to a real place? Did the Egyptians maybe make this up, right? That's a separate question, and I can't speak to that because I can only, I because for that you would have to find real Atlantis. I mean, Jimmy Corsetti thinks that Atlantis is the Eye of Africa, and when I look at the text at Edfu, there's actually reference to an eye, okay, the Eye of Ra, basically. And it's interesting. I wasn't thinking about the Eye of Africa when I was looking at this, and I'm going, wait a minute, there's somebody that thinks that the Eye of Africa is where Atlantis used to be. Now, I know there's people that disagree with that, and it's not the point. I'm not trying to argue at all that I'm saying that either Edgar Cayce knew what he was talking about or Atlantis is a real place. Having said all of that, okay, so this is my disclaimer. If you get criticized, Trevor, this is your answer. Your answer is no. We're not. The Edfu text is not proof that Atlantis is a real place. It is, however, proof that Plato didn't lie about getting the story from Egypt. And by the way, Graham makes this really clear in Magicians of the Gods. In that chapter, he says the first step is look at, first of all, did Plato get the story from Egypt? And then you can ask the question if Atlantis is a real place, right? And so, yeah, so I just wanted to make sure I pointed this out. Now, when it comes to I know there's people that are interested in the details of Edgar Cayce's prophecies and everything. I understand that. I think that Edgar Cayce tapped into some truth, but not everything I think that Edgar Cayce saw in his sleeping state necessarily has a real correlate. It could be, for example, things that he saw that we haven't discovered yet. It's possible.
Yeah.
For example, I think the Akashic records is an interesting concept because that does remind me of the holographic principle, right? The holographic principle says that our reality, our experience of gravity and everything and space is really a projection of information, entropy that's stored on the rim of the universe, right? And in a metaphoric way, that is the Akashic records. It's
Yeah.
on the rim. If it's on the rim of the universe, all the history of the universe is basically mapped onto a lower dimensional plane that surrounds us, like a black hole has an event horizon, right?
Yeah.
So when I see Edgar Cayce speaking about Akashic records, this is what I am seeing, and I think this is an amazing insight by him, right? It's a
Yeah.
metaphorical insight. But I mean, then there is something like the right forepaw of the Sphinx, which I think is incorrect. And in fact, I'm not sure that some of these details with the Atlanteans coming across to Egypt and Rata and some of these details, I don't know. I don't know if it's true or false. I'm just saying is that I look at this whole thing from the text of the Egyptians first and foremost, okay? And then what I do is I compare that to what Edgar Cayce may have said and other wise people have said. And then I ask myself, is there any way that they could have known this? And if the answer is no, then we have a real divination on our hands. Like, you remember the author that you mentioned that was predicting, what was it again? You said the author, he knew about, you mentioned it just about a few minutes ago, an author that basically predicted something that hadn't been published yet. Remember?
Um, Not
Well,
specifically.
it's
Know a lot
okay.
of examples of that.
Yeah, but don't worry about it. Anyways, that's an example of that. If you have, or like they say the Emerald tablets. I have to tell you, I'm not a fan of the Emerald tablets. I think the Emerald tablets are a modern age invention by Maurice Doreal. He may have drawn on the Book of the Dead in his, what he's saying,
Yeah.
but did he really have tablets that were shown to him and he translated them, blah 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 blah? I don't think so. Because we don't have any proof that there's no independent verification of what he's saying. So can you build a house of cards on this? Of course you can, but the house of cards
Yeah.
can easily collapse. So I don't have any faith in the Emerald tablets. However, there are some themes in the Emerald tablets that obviously are Egyptian. Like, like for example, Amenti means Western. So the Hall of Amenti, could that be the cave of Osiris? Of course it could be. It's
Yeah.
possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's definitely like, I mean, it may have even been pulled from some of the mystery school traditions as well. And I think there's
Hmm.
definitely some real knowledge in that text for sure, either way.
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah.
we've never proved that it's in a actually, he claimed that he astrally read it somehow when it was still stored in the Great Pyramid. So it's possible we could find
Right.
that if we get into those chambers, which we're working on.
Yeah.
But yeah, and when you're looking at Edgar Cayce's, I agree with you. It's like we're not gonna if you read the Bible like it's fact, you're gonna miss all the levels of metaphor. If you listen to
Yeah.
Jesus, what he says, he spoke in parables the whole time. A lot of
Yeah.
that stuff, even if it is true in real life, it also has these metaphoric levels of the esoteric symbolism that's only meant for the initiates to understand.
Yeah.
And you can't separate it from that. Who knows? The Atlantis myth could be about another planet, Nibiru, who
Yeah.
get destroyed or something like
Right.
that.
But interestingly, you bring up the Bible. So, for example, Exodus, right? The biblical scholars will tell you, no way. There's nothing in the archaeological record that demonstrates Exodus. But you know what? That's because they may be looking in the wrong era, right? As you probably know, David Roll has is he that is his life's project. I think David Roll has shown that you can basically reconstruct Exodus in the Middle Kingdom. There is actually archaeological evidence that it supports the whole story of Exodus. So it just depends on corroborating evidence. So I would say that when you look at mythological text, right? Or you look at prophecies, or you look at psychic divinations, whatever it is, if you have no other corroboration, then you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt because there's obviously people that are making this up, right? They have
Yeah,
ulterior motives. not Edgar Cayce. My impression of Edgar Cayce, he was a very noble person. He was very caring about other people. So Edgar Cayce is a big exception, which is, I think, why he became so well known, because he was true to his heart. I think he did see things when he was asleep, and he reported true from the heart and soul. So I have a really good vibe from Edgar Cayce, but it doesn't mean that everything he said is correct. But if we find things that actually corroborate, and one of those things is the Akashic records. That's clearly after that was discovered just 10 years ago, the new model holographic principle, right? And the funny thing is, when I found out about the holographic principle, I thought about Edgar Cayce. I thought about the Akashic records. I'm going, wow, this is something that he kind of sort of, mentioned in his prophecies.
Yeah, and I'll just want to say about the Akashic Records quick, couple things that are really interesting to me where I think I think there's precedent for this existing going back way to the Greek Elysian Fields or Eleusis, the I think it's the ether. I think it's basically dark matter. I think it's basically something, and even Einstein, he wrote a paper about the ether actually existing that was suppressed until only a few years ago. It was just actually released. And it comes to Nassim Harriman, actually, who I really like a lot of the things he says about physics. And he's got this one talk that's called the physics of spirituality or something like that.
Mm. Yeah,
Amazing talk. And he laid
right.
it out in this way that was beautiful because I believe it really is this thing that Tesla, everyone was kind of touching on, that it's this all-pervading fluid substance that's within and omnipotently,
Mhm.
overlapping all material existence. And it's this like, yeah, invisibly very fine fluidic substance in which every event in the creation leaves an impression on. So this
Yeah, but
impression you
right.
can go back and read.
But the important thing is, right, does it encode information? And that's why the holographic principle is so attractive. Because remember, right, Stephen Hawking basically in so many ways proposed that information is lost in black holes. And that created a huge controversy, which called the black hole wars. And then on the other side, Gerard de Hooft and Leonard Susskind, they said there's something wrong with this Hawking's theory, right? And so they ended up ruling everything else out. And what they ended up with is the holographic principle, which says that the information it's about Akashic records, right? It means it's a depository, another a repository of information that everybody can access to from all parts of the earth, right? This is kind of like what Edgar Cayce was saying, and he was tapping into the records. And the physicists are telling us that this is how the universe is structured, that the information that produces our experience of gravity, of space, of everything is not here, actually. It's not in the ether that pervades us. It's way out there in another complete in a far, far away in a distant galaxy, to quote a famous movie producer.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, or
it's
it's on a different dimension, you could almost say, or a different density or a different
absolutely. Yeah.
outside of time space as we know it.
That's the definition of it. You're exactly right. It's on a lower dimensional level. That's the definition of the holographic principle, that the information is encoded on a lower dimensional level, and that lower dimensional level, just like in a black hole, right? So the conclusion was the information is not lost in the black hole. It's actually encoded on the rim of the black hole, which is the entropy, right? The entropy is a record of the structured energy that existed before, and that structure is lost when whatever falls into the black hole, but it's not lost forever. The bits and pieces of that energy, the entropy, is still recorded on the rim of the black hole. And so that was the solution to the black hole paradox, right? And so exactly what you said, it's a lower dimensional state of a higher dimensional structural order, and energy of a higher dimensional structured energy. And so it's a great example of how Edgar Cayce may have tapped into something that's totally real. And Graham Hancock, of course, he's pursuing this as well. He thinks that when we are in an altered state, ayahuasca, DMT, etc., we might be able to observe this these other realms, right? And in other words, it's not just created inside of our minds. It may be something that's real, that's outside of our minds, and you might be able to study it, communicate with it when you are in this altered state. This is what Graham is pursuing. And I think it's interesting. I think maybe the scientists of the future, they will be on a DMT trip together and see if they can observe the same thing. And if they can, that's actually evidence that we're not talking about something that's internally created, but something that is externally perceived, that's in common, and everybody can actually perceive this, right? So,
Yeah, yeah, I think you're getting to the roots of really what the entire Egyptian entire cosmology or the entire religion, science, the whole thing. I mean, this is what it was centered on, was actually creating a science of how to access that dimension and get into there.
yes.
And yeah, not to jump into any other big subjects really, but have you ever read Transylvanian Sunrise or heard of that? The Radu
No.
Sinamar. This
Mm-mm.
book is well, it's a book series. And it starts with the Romanian Sphinx and what's underneath there, but it's talking
Mm-hmm.
about basically a hall of records in ancient technology under
Mm-hmm.
Romania and that it's connected to Egypt. And it's talking about a first-hand account, eyewitness account, basically, of going in and seeing this working technology.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's claiming that basically they went in under this chamber underneath the Giza Plateau, pretty deep, like a couple hundred meters at least, it said, I think. And there's this chair there that was a kind of technology with crystals, and you sit down and it's an interface to your own consciousness, and it basically is a thought amplification device, something
Mm-hmm.
like that. But
Mm-hmm.
it can take you, if you're someone who has some level of conscious development, some level of clairvoyant faculties already opened up, it can accentuate that like a psychic amplifier.
Mm-hmm.
And so the one guy who was basically this kind of very very advanced soul, he sat down and he starts talking about well, basically this is a time machine. You sit down in this thing and I played with it a bit and then I sent myself back and I started sitting with Jesus and listening to his teachings. That happened. So he's basically describing that there's an Akashic record reader machine or something that can bring you up to that level, and that might sound pretty crazy to people, if you call it a time machine, but it's not sending you back in time. It's projecting your consciousness to this.
And this is under the Sphinx, you're saying?
This is under the Giza Plateau, is what they say, and there's another one of the same machine under the Romanian Sphinx as well. This is a
Have you ever read The Time Machine from
H.G. Wells
1918?
or
Yeah, H.G. Wells, right? Do you remember
I
when
remember
he
that.
so when he arrives in the future, he arrives in front of a Sphinx, and all of a sudden his time machine disappears, and then he just sees the track marks disappearing inside the Sphinx. So it's funny that you say this because
Wow.
that's a theme that H.G. Wells basically wrote about in The Time Machine.
I'm sure he knew something. I wouldn't be
Maybe,
surprised. I mean,
right.
there's things that are I don't know, there's recent patents that look at the actually the guy, I don't know his name, but the guy who developed the TR3B, which is the black triangular they supposedly reverse engineered extraterrestrial technology to make a stealth craft.
Hmm.
And the guy who actually holds the patent to that, he had another patent that had to do with granite obelisks. And he said that the granite obelisk could be used to build like a teleportation device kind of thing as well. And that's jumping into a couple things that are kind of could take a lot more time as we're coming close to maybe wrapping up some of these ideas. But there was some level of quantum physics that the ancients had, and they were using it. It's not necessarily the same direction we've gone with our sciences. It's a different path of science. So it's not like they've developed our sciences past where we've gotten them, but they took a different approach and they went much further than us on their approach than we've gone on ours. It was
Yeah.
more of a crystal based technology. They really understood crystals, how they could store information and energy and be used.
Hmm.
Um, so something they were onto back then was not only developed because of their focus on this process of actually enlightening oneself, activating the chakras, going through this process that ultimately opens the third eye and opens that entire realm to you. which was so important even to the Greeks when the Greeks were doing their Greek Orphic mysteries and Eleusinian mysteries, and they're stimulating these transcendental mind states of mind, going, taking drugs and going into the underground pitch black labyrinths and experiencing their own death in this way, sensory deprivation, and putting their minds into these places, or giving the oracles these caves to go live in and breathe these volcanic fumes that would, all these different kinds of things that were different methods of stimulating other states of consciousness, because they were, I don't think the Egyptians were so often using drugs or substances, though there's some evidence of, yeah, DMT in the acacia tree, or some of the plants, the
Oh,
white
the lotus flower. There's actually in the cannibal hymn in the Pyramid of Unas, there's a mention of wine. There's a in the up in the gable on the east side. There's a mention of wine, and then all of a sudden, he has a vision of two skies turning, and then after that, he's basically vomiting or spitting out what he calls the red parts, right? So you put this all together and it's very reminiscent of the Egyptian version of what Brian Muraresku in his book Immortality Key calls the kukion, right? The kukion is the Greek mixture that the Greek Gnostics basically consumed, and then they had visions, right? And of course, Brian's saying in his book that Christianity started out like this. It was basically entheogens in this mixture, right? It's a Greek. It started with the Greeks, right?
Aldous Huxley too.
Yeah, but
Actually,
it's re
he used the same word because the Greeks also used the word soma was one of
yeah,
the things. And
yes,
in Brave New World, that's the name of the drug that's given to these people, and he describes it as
right.
Christianity without all the negative effects.
Right, exactly, right. Yeah. So so Brian is actually thinks that if not putting words in his mouth, but I believe he thinks this goes way back, and of course Graham thinks that this goes all the way back to prehistoric shamanism, right? That
Oh yeah.
shamans they were, and that's what you're saying. What you're saying is that knowledge, Gnosticism, right? The knowledge of the extended knowledge that wasn't immediately obtainable by doing empirical science and reductive thinking, right? There's another way to tap into knowledge like that, and that was by the use of herbals that put you into an altered state. And I have a great example of this in the pyramid text also, and that is the mouth opening ritual. It turns out, and this coming from the Egyptologists, Trevor. So when you are in the burial chamber, you're looking on the north wall in the upper register, there is the famous mouth opening ritual. Okay. So it's basically the mummified Unas, the jaws are open, you make the cut to the mouth, right, to open the mouth, right? And then you wash with salt and water and everything, and so that the mummy can now start consuming the goods that keep it alive, right? And so, but what Wolfgang helped piece together is that there actually is a prehistoric ritual phonetically embedded in the mouth opening ritual, right? So it's mind-boggling. You think that, well, this is 4,500 years old, that must be the beginning of this ritual, mouth opening. But no, this actually is based on a shamanic ritual that goes way, way earlier than the pyramid text. And this is coming from an Egyptologist who's saying this. And the way that he discovered this is with Heka, phonetic invocations embedded into the ritual, the text of the ritual. And what is that prehistoric ritual? It's called the statuette making ritual. So when somebody in prehistoric Egypt died, the relatives had a shaman make a wooden statue, carve the eyes, the face, right? And what later became what they called the Shaptius, right? What are they called again? Can't remember. I'll remember in a moment. And so and and in order for the shaman to imbue the statue with the living spirit of the deceased, he had to go into a trance, right? He goes into a trance, and then he chases after the dead spirit in the afterlife, recruiting animal spirits. They help him to find the shadow of this person, bring the shadow back, and literally reattach the shadow to this little statuette, right? So he comes out of trance, he brings back the spirit, which is the shadow of this person, attaches it to the statuette, and then the relatives put that statuette into a chapel, and then they pray to it like it's a living representation of the dead person. This is a prehistoric ritual performed by a shaman who was in an altered state, right? And in that altered state, he was able to tap into the afterlife, right? It's a perfect example of what you were just saying, is that there is other ways to know about reality, but it's just that something that we can't tap into when we are reductionistic and rational, and we discipline ourselves to detach our emotions, for example,
Yeah.
our intuition, our our creative side. When we detach all of that from ourselves and we become these rational robots, that's how, that's how Western philosophy with Descartes, right? And with Western science, that's how I was trained. I'm a reductionist, basically. You can call me a reductionistic scientist. But one big thing that I've learned since I've been doing alternative history for the last 8 years is that it is important to also, part of your mind, the creative portion of your mind, it has to be able to stay open to these very implausible ideas. Because because you won't be able to break a paradigm if you always think rationally based on what you know. The only way that paradigms get broken is by transcending the limits of our current knowledge. You have to be able to walk out of the box, right? This is a common saying. You have to think out of the box. And in order to do that, you need to have a little bit of an irrational streak inside of you. You have to be able to think illogically sometimes to be able to expand the horizons. That's very important. I had my thesis advisor, he was like that. He was a brilliant scientist, Masayasu Nomura. Uh, he had that in him. He was an extremely rational person, but he had this little streak, and that's it was made him so brilliant. And so I think it is important for the scientists of the future, and even scientists that train today, that they don't get intimidated by the plausibility squad out there. The people, the debunkers and everything, because the debunkers, what are they doing? They're and they're not even always following scientific principles, okay? But what they're doing is they are attacking other ideas based on what they think is plausible, what they think is probable, and that is not the way to practice science. Definitely not. Okay. Now, I'm not saying that every single implausible idea is going to end up being correct. I'm not saying that at all. But we're not doing a good service to our society if we start ostracizing and demonizing ideas that are out there, fringe ideas, which is what it's called, right? No, we can't do that. We have to actually we have to preserve the freedom of people to think out of the box, right? It does not excuse those people from still going through, a vetting process. You still have to vet the ideas, you still have to go through rational thinking and all that, but you should not eliminate good idea, creative ideas just because they're implausible or because they're improbable. It's not a good thing to do.
Yeah, if you're locked into the rational mind, you're not going to figure out the big puzzle. You're not going to
Yeah,
solve the big riddle.
yeah, yeah,
It's it's necessary for part of it, but like we're saying, there's the baboon and the ibis. There's the rational
yes,
mind, and then there's the inner source, which is you've got guys like Nikola Tesla, guys like Walter Russell, guys like Leonardo da Vinci. All the most brilliant minds I've ever heard of in my life. They've all had these quotes that are something to the effect of like, when you turn yourself off and you tune in and you receive, that's when your inner genius gets turned on. That's when your
yeah,
connection to the universal source of all knowledge and life and creation is
right,
not blockaded by what happens when you're locked in the rational left brain. Um,
yes,
you need both brain hemispheres, and if you're going to reach into the truth, it's actually more through the right and the intuitive and creative side.
right,
The eye of Ra and the eye of Horus, these are the two opposite views of the pineal gland from the different brain
right,
hemispheres.
right.
Everything, like I'm saying, is
Yeah, the
balanced.
symbolism that you're citing, right? And of course, you know symbolism well. You know way more about symbolism than I do. But the symbolism is telling us we need balance. We need a balance between, rational thinking and a little bit of creative thinking, right? And so it both are necessary. And again, I'm not trying to say that every single crazy idea is going to be end up being correct. In fact, most of them may be incorrect, but that does not give you a license to go after people that have crazy ideas in the way that nowadays people are communicating with each other. I think
Yeah.
it's doing a disservice to society to to ostracize and to cancel and whatever you want to call it, people that have out of the box ideas. It's also doing a disservice to society to flood, people with misinformation. That's also a disservice. So you see, it's a balance. It's difficult to make one stance and not,
Yeah.
respect the other side. I'm trying to be equally handed, even-handed to both sides. I think there needs to be a process that taps into the good of both sides and eliminating the bad of both sides. Too much rationality, too much too much creative thinking. Neither one of those two things are necessarily good. I think you have to have balance, and balance is not easy to do.
Yeah, I think that's why I have so much respect for you and for John West, for the people like if you were 100% rational about all this without any stepping outside the box, you would
You
just
wouldn't be
make
talking
the
to me.
copper and build the Sphinx. That's
Yeah,
what you
right,
believe. You
right.
believe the things that they're telling us. And
Yeah.
absolutely 100%. A shamanistic
Mm.
society is one that is completely open to the idea of this astral realm, to the idea that the soul is beyond the body, that it can be beyond the body, that you can venture forth with just your consciousness. You can go out.
Right,
Being open to that, I think it's something that the entire world was based on animistic societies that
right,
believed that forever
right.
until,
You,
and I think Egypt is the ultimate culmination of that, turning
yeah.
into a science at such an advanced level where
Hmm.
they nailed out these processes by which you can accelerate your own psychic, uh, unlock these higher faculties and all this stuff. That's what's so fascinating to me and John and you, I think, about this is that they've turned this magic into a science basically,
Right.
and
You
so
know, what the big irony is, Trevor. One of Graham's most ardent, outspoken critics is John Hoops, right, from Kansas University. He's an archaeology or anthropology, I can't remember right now.
I've dealt with
And
him. He's
yeah,
blocked me
yeah.
and stuff.
The great irony is that in 2006, I don't know all of his published papers, but I looked at this paper because it was interesting. He actually proposed that in this a Central American culture, and I can't remember the details, but the upshot is that there was a network of cultural diffusion between these small little village states or whatever you want to call them, and it was based on shaman. It's a shamanistic network, right? So so from all people, for him to go after Graham for proposing diffusionism, cultural diffusionism based on shamanistic knowledge, right? It's the height of hypocrisy, okay?
Yeah.
Because
Well,
he himself proposed a very, I mean, okay, in all fairness, his model is regional. So he's obviously what he's criticizing is the hyperdiffusion model of Graham. But you know what? The funny thing is that he also proposed a similar, on a smaller scale, a regional diffusionism based on shamanistic networks. And so when I'm reading this, I'm going, aha. So this is maybe where it's coming from. That's where the fuel of this ardor is coming from when he criticizes Graham, is because he himself
uh-huh.
believes in a smaller version of Graham's theory, right?
Yeah, well,
And
I have a paper for I have an article I actually wrote where I reference this, but I'm talking about him and some of the other people that have been totally over the top, just attacking for no reason,
yeah,
him and other people. But I found this paper. He had it still published somewhere, and it's like from when he was in high school, and he wrote this. John Hoops wrote this article that was about Atlantis. Atlantis is in the title, and he's saying, yeah, there was this thing, and I'm like. First of all, like, why would you still have that up and published if it's
hmm,
like not something you still? It's like Mark Lehner,
yeah,
the Egyptian heritage book that's about Cayce. It's like
yeah,
you're still standing by that. You said
yeah,
that. You did, and
right,
it's like, what part of your inner child got lost? You gave up on that.
right,
You
right.
know, it's
I
like,
think you. I think it's overcompensation. I think these people had extreme viewpoints before, like too much creative, too much out of the box, too much right? And so then they see some evidence, right? And then all of a sudden they turn into the other extreme. They become overly rational or
What's fear, you know?
hypercritical, right? This is an internal, so they're actually they have an internal struggle with themselves, right? They come from opposite roots and then they end up on the other side, right? And then they become those vocal critics, and but they're really, what they're criticizing is their own past, the way they used to think themselves, right? On the other hand, Trevor, I was fortunate enough to be trained in an environment where we ended up meeting Nobel laureates, right? We used to, when I was in the MD PhD program at UC Irvine, we used to organize lectures by Nobel laureates. They're usually biologists, famous biologists, and we got to talk to them in a private level. And what they all had in common is that they had an unusually an unusually elegant way to think about complicated problems. That's the first thing. And the second thing is they had an amazingly creative mind. They had both. They had creativity and they also had amazing ways to rationally, find a path to a complicated problem. So it just really taught me that that's the way to discover nature, is by having this balance. And when I look at, social media wars that are going on, I'm looking at people, this partisanship that we're dealing with right now, right? Those are usually it's either too creative or it's too rational. And so we have these two big factions. The extreme factions are basically clashing with each other. Like, this the satellite business that, it's been coming out, right? It's the same, basically the same thing all over again. It's just a different topic, but ultimately it's a clash of extreme versions of what the truth is. The truth is somewhere in the middle, and the extreme versions are clashing with each other, and it ruins it for the actual truth seekers. You know what I'm saying? So this is unfortunately, extremism is what sells social media capital. That's the problem.
Yeah. Yes, definitely. And I think this is at the root of really what's been preventing people from figuring all this. This is the mentality that ends up leading the whole field of Egyptology for
Right,
hundreds of years to
right,
miss the water weathering right in front of their face. And it takes a John West to say, "Hey, the emperor's wearing no clothes." Like,
right.
look what's right in front of your
Yeah,
face. You're gonna miss
yeah,
it if you're locked into this,
right,
if you entrench yourself into these
yeah,
theories that need to be upheld. And then you have all of academia at this point just fearing for their careers and their lives and their reputations if they so much as consider anything out of it's a fear of being
right.
targeted. And um,
At the
they have
least,
these people like Hoops coming at them, telling them it's
right,
dangerous to read Graham Hancock.
right,
Don't say his name. Don't say
bad.
Atlantis.
Yeah,
Think about aliens. Like it's like open up a little
right,
bit because the reality, whatever it is, we're seeing more and more, especially with the Coffer Project. There's
right.
something else going on.
Look at how look
Bigger.
at how the scientists do this, right? Like we were saying, Stephen Hawking proposed something that violated the conservation of information in the universe, right? You could say, well, was Stephen Hawking proposing an implausible model? But look what it led to. It led to a new discovery, right? That's how you peacefully resolve disputes like that, right? That's how it should be. When somebody proposes an out of the box model, then it should prompt the other side to collaborate with that person and saying, can you propose an experiment, or can you propose a way to find new evidence that we can resolve this conflict, right? That's the way to do it. Not to
Yeah.
kill each other, but defame each other on social media. It's the worst way to handle this, because there are good ideas out there. In Even if the idea is wrong, or even if the idea is partially wrong or partially true, right? There's still something valuable in there. There's a pearl potentially that could help us to advance our knowledge. But we're not having this kind of discourse. This is the problem because the people that are actually running a thoughtful discourse on the internet, they're not getting rewarded. They're not getting rewarded with subscribers and likes and whatever YouTube money and who knows what it is, right? The people that get the biggest attention are the people that make extreme either this side debunkers or the absolute crazy ones, right? On the other side, they're the ones that get most of the attention. But the people that are actually on the cusp, right, in the middle, that are willing to negotiate what the two between the two sides and look at the evidence, not theories, but the evidence itself. Those people are not getting rewarded. And I'm not talking about myself. I actually don't care at all. But I'm saying there are good podcasters out there. Like you're a good researcher. I know a good podcaster. I've met a couple of them that are not getting attention as they should, and they're really thoughtful about how they look at the evidence. They're being even-handed, right? And nobody pays attention to them, or few people pay attention to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, extremism
Uh,
sells, and moderation is boring. This is the problem.
And it's a matter of attention span too, because it's like I'm not one of the people that's going to cater to the goldfish memory span people or the TikTok generation that's like working on sound bites, like especially like in
Right,
politics, you see these debates. Okay, you got 20 seconds to answer this question. It's like,
right.
stop with that. Okay,
Yes.
let's be ready to get into something. This one's going on about two and a quarter hours now, so we can wrap it up soon. But I
Okay.
don't like doing things that are less than 2 hours or less than an hour and a half. So much of my work, it needs to be seen in these big, wide. Let's get into it. Let's
Right.
not. Like Joe Rogan or something. It's like he does these 3 hour things, and it's like that's where we go when we want to hear what a politician really thinks during
Yeah.
the election.
Right.
It's like, oh, Joe Rogan lets him talk for 2, 3 hours.
Right.
Let's look at that.
Yeah. You
It's
can't you can't distill a person down to a soundbite. That's not possible.
no,
Even
I miss
person like
everything.
yeah, like a person like Zahir Was is a complex person. I know he's getting a lot of flack, and he has also have fans, right? But Zahir Was is a complex person. There's not just, you can't just look at him in one way and demonize him or in another way and worship him, right?
Well,
He
the
has
whole
both.
system around him is so complex.
Yeah, yeah,
People don't even know about that. Like, what's above him?
yeah,
You think this is all
right,
his fault? Like, no,
right. Yeah.
he's
I
being
have
told what to do, and
Right. I've had really amazing interactions with Egyptologists, right? Like, for example, Peter Manuelian from Harvard University. He's an amazing person. We have a good working relationship, or with Raj Papazian, who helped me when had questions about texts from the third dynasty, or from Florence Friedman, or Dieter Kort, right? There's a perfect example. We're friends, okay? Dieter is amazing, and Dieter entertains out of the box ideas, right? So we shouldn't have this monolithic idea of an Egyptologist, an anthropologist, and historian, right? That they're somehow restricted, narrow-minded, bad people. No, they're not. There are some amazing people amongst them. And there's some bad apples, like in our side, there's bad apples too, right? There's people that basically
yeah.
they don't have anything to say really that's of use, but they're saying it anyways, right? So it goes both ways, and I think the best way is to be respectful and try to have a communication with the other side to see what it is that may be valuable in what they have to say. Like, Mark Lehner, for example, he was very helpful just a couple of weeks ago, like a couple of months ago, when we were looking for a carbon date of a wreath that was placed on a sarcophagus found inside of that pyramid what is it, south of the Djoser pyramid, right? So Keith Hamilton wanted to know what the date of that wreath is, because it could help you to date the sarcophagus and the pyramid and everything. And we couldn't find that carbon. And so we ended up asking Mark Lehner, and he was very helpful, guiding us in the direction. And, so I just want to, I have a message of peace. I think I don't want to have a war between us and the traditional historians. That doesn't mean that we agree with what they're saying every single time, and we have quite a few disagreements, right? But it shouldn't be taken personally. I actually think if you are proven wrong, that is a badge of honor in science. Okay, you don't have to be right always, right? If people will prove that Mahit is wrong, she was not a statue, whatever, that's okay. But what I'm hoping that my ideas do is it hopefully will stimulate new research, like, looking under the Sphinx, like getting more evidence, right? Because that's really what you do in science all the time. When you have a dispute, the way to resolve it is by doing new experiments.
Yeah, 100%. So glad you said all that because I so agree with that. And honestly, whether or not someone agrees with me, that has very little to do with whether or not I'm going to respect them.
Right.
Respect everyone, hands down, for
Yeah.
starters. You're going to get respect from me until you prove you don't deserve it. But it's
Right.
there from the start. And it's like, I love when people bring comments that are critical or bring up other things I didn't know, as long as
Right.
they're not using profanity and just being idiots instead, like bringing nothing at all to just,
Right.
oh, you're wrong. It's like, shut up,
Right.
grow up, get out of
Yeah.
kindergarten here. This
Yeah.
is, and I try to lift up all the people around me, just regardless of whether or not I agree with. There's no one that I agree with everything on.
Mhm.
No one at all, not even John West. There's certain researchers I give these basically a trust level to, a percentage, and the top people, people like you and Robert and John, it's like you're getting up to maybe a 95 or higher percent trust level is maybe the
Yeah.
top.
Temporarily,
But
maybe.
it's like,
We can always
yeah,
fall
you
from grace,
always
right?
adjust that,
Mm.
the more you see it, I just saw some guy I kind of was respecting for a minute and then he came out. I saw this video yesterday and started just, trashing the whole Coffer project and he had nothing. He clearly had no clue what was going on.
Yeah.
And that's one other thing that it's like a lot of what we're talking about today ties in with the Coffer Project and new things coming out from the Giza Plateau, make what we're talking about today so much more important as the context to understand. There is so much more to say that there were these parts of Egyptian culture that went way before, way before the first dynasties and so much of the work from John and others in the past have built up that um, base of information. And yeah, I think the Coffer Project is actually something that's polarizing it very well. And I think I'm actually going to put in the description also this article that I kind of brought up quickly earlier, but it's called the War for Archaeology. That's
Mhm.
what I called the article because it was about this whole thing going back to the 90s and John, what he was doing, and this war between Zahi and Graham when they got in the fight, and Zahi
Right.
hates Robert Bivol, and they had these issues. And I'm very glad that Graham has made peace with Zahi and John
Yes.
West himself up to his dying day. I mean, I was with him 3 days before he passed. It like he was on the same thing up to the very end, saying, Zahi could actually be open to this stuff if people respectfully talk to him. And
Right.
I think he's a human being. He can
Mhm.
make his choices. He's made bad choices in the past. There's no denying that in terms of like aligning himself with things that, he couldn't get out of necessarily. But he's compromised his ability to speak freely in ways, and I think he wants to in some. But everyone is a human being who's got free will, and regardless of even what they've done in the past, they have the right to change and learn and grow. And so I think it's really important what you're talking about here, that it really doesn't matter what you think or what we think. It matters that we respectfully have this dialogue because the
Yes.
world needs to speak about this to
Right.
each other without shouting and yelling or
Right.
just shutting people out before you know what's going on. None of us
Mhm.
knows what's happening. This
Right.
reality is a complete mystery.
Mhm.
We're looking back to the ancient Egyptians because they seem to have some concept of
Mhm.
what this reality is, but we are
Mhm.
all in the dark, wandering, trying to figure it out. Anyone who thinks they know the answers is clearly showing themselves to be a fool. This is what Plato and Aristotle were saying all the way back then. And
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
so,
the scientists, for them, prior knowledge is an excuse to do more experiments, right? And but in this discourse that we're having, prior prior knowledge is basically supposedly the truth, and it isn't. It may be probably the truth, probably okay. I concede maybe it's more likely to be the truth, but not for sure. And when
Yeah.
you find evidence that contradicts it, then you have a problem, okay? And you have to just acknowledge that.
Yeah, it's an educated guess, really.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so I'm gonna ask you to wrap it up here in a second and just pull this all together into a conclusion of what we're really looking at and what's most important for the world to be thinking about and what are the next steps we're going to be taking in the coming years and how I don't know how people should start to treat these new discoveries as they're coming out and I think everything you're basically already wrapping it up here into some of the most important points that we need to be open. We need to if these conversations, if this was not a war for archaeology, which my whole point in that article is to say it shouldn't be, you know, and John, he did not want to beat Hawass. He didn't want to win. He wanted to end the war so that these ideas could be peer reviewed, could be discussed in universities. If we could
yeah,
get all the minds that are in all these colleges being indoctrinated currently to actually be free to explore the mysteries that they think are most important. If students in these universities could say, well, I'm going to do my thesis on Graham Hancock's works and analyze that stuff, or go like you have and actually take the trail of evidence deeper than anyone has before and expand on it. That is what we need. So I think you're an exemplary just absolutely the a role model for what a researcher should be in terms of balancing the rational and the open-mindedness, um, focusing on the evidence and not taking for any not taking as fact what we're told this timeline was, or
mhm,
ever trying to fit a piece into the picture you already see,
yeah.
following wherever that evidence goes, even if it feels crazy. So, yeah, I'll just ask you to give us a few final thoughts here because we've recorded about 5 hours today. It's amazing. So I mean, it couldn't have gone better. It's just such important stuff to
It's a
me.
great conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any
Yeah,
final thoughts?
yeah. Well, I think we covered two big topics, right? But they're connected. We talked about the Sphinx and the age of the Sphinx and written records that may contradict what the going story is. And then we talked about the Edfu text, right? To what extent Plato did in fact inherit something from Egypt, and what are the big themes, right? The big themes are written records and how they are is that is what in Egypt allows resurrection to occur. And then we talked about how the discourse is failing us, right? The discourse between people that disagree is not conducive to new discoveries. That's a problem, and social media has significantly contributed to this problem. And the reason is because social media are rewarding bad behavior instead of rewarding good behavior. That's the biggest problem. And so
As is
I,
the academic community and the political system and the so.
yeah, yeah, exactly, right. And the what's the way out? Well, I think the way out of this is to go back to, you know, the 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 natural way to investigate nature, which the natural way is a mixture of internal knowledge, Gnosticism, so to speak, and a disciplined empirical way to explore nature. You have to have both. And so when you have a person that's predominantly on the Gnostic side and you have a person that's predominantly on the empirical side, and these two represent these two people clash, then I think the best lesson is what the Dalai Lama says, that you have to have both. It needs to be a balance between the spiritual, and that's a spiritual scientist is probably the most well-equipped person to investigate the unknown. And so I think we should honor that aspect of in the other people that we're dealing with. Like when we're seeing somebody who's not as rational, he's more intuitive and creative, we should honor that part in them, and vice versa. We should honor someone who's extremely rational, because there is things that we can the way that you can benefit from this is if you collaborate. You bring the hyper rational and the hyper creative person together, and then you have them recite each other's opinions, ideas, and then you see where there is overlap, and you bring those people together, and then you have a powerful, so it's teamwork is really. But if we keep going the way we are, we're going to have a society where good people with good ideas and people with good discipline are going to say, I've had it. I'm not going to participate in this environment, right? So I think this is that's actually be above all, whether or not I am right about the Sphinx, whether or not I'm right about the Edfu text, I am willing to give all of that away, to say I'm wrong, okay? If we can just take away this one thing, is that our discourse has to improve. That is really important, because otherwise, as a civilization, we will not be able to advance and to heal, right? So much damage is already going on between people of different partisanship, right? We have to this is the most important thing. It's a mission for our society to learn how to have respectful discourse again. It's extremely important, and honor the people even if they're wrong. And in science, like I give you an example, right? Being wrong is actually a badge of honor, because you helped the other people to disprove something. That means you know more,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Absolutely. So well said. Yeah, and there's something to it at the very heart of this entire thing, the whole grand mystery of Egypt. It's really there is a very esoteric riddle at the heart of it that's one of the things that I think John really taught me. One of the most important things was that if you don't see that it is a riddle, that there's a question being asked, how are you ever going to answer it? How are you
That's
ever going
right.
to solve the riddle if you don't understand it to be a riddle? And
Yeah.
I think it is. I think it's all a code. And
Yeah. He was a very humble person, John Anthony West.
yeah,
He was outspoken. He was very outspoken, very, on the outside he was aggressive, right? He came strong. But internally, from, what I'm observing, he was a very humble person.
yeah. I mean, there was nobody who was quite on the path he was on, and it was because
Hmm.
he thought for himself, because he had the rational mind, he had the book smarts, the learning, but he had an open mind still. And I think that is the key to especially figuring out the Egyptian mysteries and the Hall of Record mysteries.
That's why the jaw sign is a fitting symbol of John Anthony West, right? Because it's straight, but there's a bend. That
It's
that's
so
that
fitting.
it's the interesting angle, right? So that's John Anthony West in a nutshell.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I totally agree that it's really about changing the nature of our discourse. If we want to move into a better world, if we want to fulfill the grand magnum opus of the great work of building back an actual global world peace and an actual civilization, because folks, you live in today's world, you've never seen a civilization. I'll just tell you that way. That's not what
No,
this is. This
no.
is the tail end remnants of a dark age wrapping up right here.
Mhm.
If we want to see a real world peace, a true global civilization, or understand what a real civilization looks like, we have to look very deep into the past. And we
Yeah.
can resurrect that. We can bring it all back. And there's a science of the stars. There's a science of the soul. There's a science of physical healing and medical technology and energy technology and all these things we discuss in association with this ancient knowledge. And we can bring that all back. We can create a new golden age. We're going to, actually. I believe it's inevitable. It's just a matter of when, really, not if. And I think the path to that is the kind of research you're pursuing, pushing straight towards this real core of the most important questions we have to ask that do have to do with the origins of civilization themselves and the origins of humanity. And this was the same kind of answer Filippo gave me when I was interviewing him recently. What I say, like, this is about who we are as a species, on a racial level, the human race, at finding self-knowledge. That's the only way we're going to be able to push forward into a future that actually benefits us all, and benefits the ecosystem and the rest of the animals and plant life and everything. And yeah, like Edgar Cayce said, it's about finding a reconnection between us and nature. And I think we are. It's so exciting to see that we're pushing through this transition into that kind of world. And yeah, I think if we find another chance to talk again someday soon, maybe we can get a little bit into some of the copper project, or discuss more how that's a new catalyst that's forcing
Yeah.
the world to open their minds in some
Yeah.
degree. At least
Yeah.
people that are accepting that there are,
Yeah.
it's not totally fraudulent.
Right.
We
Yeah.
want others.
I think we'll give it a little time to let things sort out. And I think, there's a few things that are in motion already, and those things have to maybe take time to develop. And so I think that conversation will happen. We're just gonna postpone it for a few months.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's so much else coming up this year, that's really exciting stuff. We've
Mhm.
got I'm gonna be putting out The Secret Underworld Part 4 and 5, um,
Great.
probably in the next week or two. I think you're really gonna like that, because I've got some stuff that really locks it in. I've been holding my tongue in parts of this interview right here, because some of this stuff applies to it. Some new disclosures the world's never seen. And
Looking forward to
there's
it. Mhm.
there's conferences, there's more interviews planned, and more series I've got coming, and I'm sure you're going to be doing a lot more this year as well. So
Don't, Trevor, don't forget your private life. This was told to
what's
me
that?
that it's important. It's important to have also a private life, a family, right? And I've been neglecting this, right? And I've heard this from people that I respect, that you have to have balance even in your personal life, right? If your entire life is just about research, ancient mysteries, then you will suffer eventually. You have to have a balanced life, and that's what I'm going to do for the next few months. I'm going to go back to the working world and go back to some being just a regular citizen.
Oh yeah, once
Yeah,
in a while
I
I'll
think
have to like drink a beer or something, or do a normal
yes,
person thing to like ground
that's
me.
right.
Be like, oh
Yeah,
yeah, I'm also a human who has a life,
yeah,
but I don't really have much of
yeah. I
much of
know,
a
I know.
chosen
You're
life.
riding, you're riding a wave. It's exciting. I listen. I'm enjoying watching you, grow. You're blossoming. It's great. So, and I know the excitement. It's amazing. It's an amazing time. You'll never forget it.
Well, I think for both you and I, it's like, oh, this is our moment. We've been waiting for this. Now
Yeah,
it's on. Now it's
yeah,
real.
right.
And so much evidence is coming forward that it's making it much harder for the
Hmm.
gatekeepers to keep suppressing this information, and that's
Hmm.
the most exciting part, because they can't
Yeah.
keep denying it anymore. So we're coming into some amazing, beautiful future I see unfolding, and I think you're
Okay.
one of the top people who's actually helping this to come forward. And so I want to thank you, not just for all of the work you've done, but for spending all these hours with me today, because this has been such a fun conversation to have. And it's so important for people to hear right now as this is all happening. So once again, you're the best, Manu. I'm so appreciative. So
Thank you.
appreciative. Yeah,
Oh, re reflecting the compliment back to you, Trevor.
thank
So
you.
thanks for having me, and I'll see you soon.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe we can do it again. In
Hmm.
a few months we'll check in or something. So
Okay.
thanks so much.
All right.